Folks, welcome to BESE this morning. I'd like to call to order the Academic Growth and Instructional Improvement Committee. Can we get a roll call, please?
Dr. Bofi? Present. Mr. Castile?
Here.
Dr. Davis? Here. Ms. Ellis is not in attendance. Mr. Garvey?
Here.
Ms. Holloway? Here. Mr. Millerine?
Here.
Mr. Morris?
Here.
Ms. Orange Jones is not in attendance. Mr. Roth?
Present.
Ms. Voce? Here. Mr. Zach Johnson?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. First item, please.
The first item is on page 1, item 1.3, consideration of the recognition of Luke Lyons. The recommendation is to receive.
Can I get a motion? Move. Mr. Garvey, a second. Dr. Davis, thank you. Opposed? Hearing none. I'd like to welcome Mr. Lyons to BESE this morning. Mr. Lyons, if you would, step forward. Got a couple of notes here for folks who may not be familiar with you yet, so I'd like to share that with everyone. Luke is a 6th grade student at Prairieville Middle in Ascension Parish. He represents Louisiana in the National Beta Club as the leadership representative. This past summer, Luke competed in a national beta speech competition in Orlando, Florida, after winning first place at the state convention. Today, Luke is going to share his speech with the board after placing first in the nation. So, Mr. Lyons, whenever you're ready.
There. His Majesty can now read my name without glasses. John Hancock said these words as President of the Continental Congress in 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was drafted. Mr. Hancock signed the Declaration first and bold. If he had not signed, who would have been the first? If you had been there, would you have led the charge to independence? My name is Luke Lyons, and I am a proud member of the Younger Primary School Beta Club, and I believe that it starts with me. Leadership, character, academic achievement, and service are the pillars that the Beta Club is built on. We bring these pillars to life by our actions. Leadership is the self-confidence to take bold steps forward, to guide others in the right direction. It is being respectful toward others while having the courage of sharing your ideas. Academic achievement is a result of hard work and discipline. It is attained through recognizing our responsibility in our own academic success. Character is the foundation of who we are, and true character is revealed during difficult times. Service is the decision to put others first and to serve our Lord by loving our neighbors as ourselves. My hope for you and for our Beta Club is that we will follow the example of our Lord Jesus Christ and of John Hancock and lead with bold convictions. For in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, we learn, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Take courage in the Lord." It starts with me, and it starts with you.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons. Mr. Lyons, I think when I grow up, I want to be like you. Any comments from the board? Dr. Bofi?
Luke, I just want to thank you. You give me so much hope for our future, for our state. So thank you so much for your words, and the delivery was impeccable.
Sorry for that delay. Other board members? Ms. Boucher?
And I just want to echo that. That was fantastic. I've been involved with the Beta Club since 1976, and I've watched young men and women, and that we have grown in Louisiana to do things as wonderful as what Luke has done. year after year after year, and I'm so glad that we are recognized in some of our outstanding youth. And Luke, you're such a representative, an excellent representative of all that is good within our state, within our educational system, and within our families here in Louisiana. So I want to congratulate you, your family members who have contributed greatly to this, all of your teachers, and the beta clubs here in Louisiana as well as across our country.
Mr. Johnson?
Luke, I just want to say, and you and I spoke before, my school does not have beta club, but we have student council, we have key club, we have 4-H, and over the course of the past year, I have seen countless student leaders, presidents, and stuff from all over the state speak, and you're one of the most polished speakers I've seen this year. You are on par with them. I'm just going to say you have a bright future, and you should definitely pursue public speaking in the future. So keep it up.
Thank you, sir. And leadership like this doesn't happen by itself. So I'd like to recognize Mom and Dad, if you would please stand up. And we also like to recognize Ms. Ashley Townsend, our educator. If you would please stand up. Thank you folks for doing such an outstanding job. Next item, please. Anyone opposed to that? Unheard, motion passes. Thank you.
The consent agenda is ready for your approval, adding item 4.1.
Motion, please. Dr. Volpe, in second. Dr. Davis, thank you. Opposed? Here none. Motion passes. Next item, please. Mr. Castillo, you have a motion for us?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Are you ready? I move that we take item 5.1 out of order and immediately following item 2.2 on the agenda.
Thank you, sir. Can I get a second to that motion? Dr. Davis? Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes. Thank you, Mr. Castillo.
And then I have a second motion, and I move that with respect to item 2.2 and 5.1, I move that we receive the two reports.
Thank you, Mr. Castillo. Can I get a second for that one? Ms. O'Shea? Opposed?
We're going to do the reports.
Yes.
Dr. Brown, you want to kick us off?
Well, let me redo this record first. The next item is on page 2, item 2.1, consideration. After 2.2.
That's right. So we changed the order here where we're going to put 5.1 and 2.2 together. So let's go ahead and move to 2.1 so we follow the order. You can take us to 2.1.
The next item is on page 2, item 2.1, consideration of request from local education agencies for waivers of policy contained in Bulletin 1706, regulations for the implementation of the Children with Exceptionalities Act for the 2021-2022 school year, submitted by the State Superintendent of Education. The department recommendation is to approve the waiver of policy in Bulletin 1706, submitted by Tangipahoa and St. Mary Parish School Systems as outlined.
Can I get a motion, please? Follow it. A second. Mr. Rob, thank you. Superintendent Brumley, any comments on this one? Okay. Superintendent Brumley, I had some concerns about this one. Discussed with some other board members. It seems to be pretty routine now that we get these waivers before the board due to the lack of educators that we were able to put in the classroom to present material. I work with some of you, as you know, I work with some of your team to get some more insight on this, and really interested to understand what the portfolio of teachers looks like in the state of Louisiana right now. So many of us are accustomed to folks taking the traditional pathway, 4 years of college, teacher certification, and then they start their career in the classroom. But that portfolio today looks much different. We've got folks that are taking the traditional path, we've got folks that are making career changes, we've got folks like myself that are retired and considering that career path. And then I've had personal experiences talking with principals throughout my district where they're unable to fill some of those teacher seats to teach particular classes. And it seems to be perpetuating, the problem is getting worse and worse. And we all know that the problem is there and we need to address it. So I'm really interested in the interest from other board members with regard to get some feedback from the department, helping us to appreciate what does that portfolio of teachers across our state look like today, and help us to appreciate the part of that portfolio that identifies those seats that are vacant today. And once we have that in hand and we have some appreciation for what that portfolio looks like, then I'm interested in what we can do to, let me back up one. Once we understand what it looks like today, I'm interested in what does it look like in 5 years for the do-nothing case. And once we understand what it looks like today, and we understand what the do-nothing case looks like, then I'd like to understand what our goal is. Where we'd like for that, what we'd like for that portfolio to look like. And then we can understand what the gap is from what we think it should be, so that we're providing the best opportunity for our students relative to what it is today. And then I'd like to understand what kind of mitigation steps are we going to take to close that gap. So when we go to the legislature next year and we have the MFP conversation, there's more to it than just asking for a specific dollar amount. This is what our base case is. This is what the problem is. Help us to solve the problem. So I'd like to put that out before the board this morning and see if we have some additional comments. Thank you. Dr. Bowley.
I will just add to that, Mr. Morris, that I have had conversations with educators who have concerns about teacher hiring, particularly in our schools that struggle the most. And so I am really interested in how do we figure out how to move the talent pipeline, especially to our schools where students have the greatest need. And actually have an idea around that, but need some clarification about what currently exists. And so, we don't pay our teachers what they're worth. I mean, I think everybody understands that. And I know that at some point in my career, there were some changes made to rehiring people who had retired. And I understand that because I think there was some abuse of the system. But I do think we have a lot of people, especially in education, who are eligible to retire fairly young, but may make a decision to ultimately come back. And if there was a way that we could bring people back, especially into our classrooms where they could serve our most vulnerable students, because we have this challenge where we want really strong, dynamic new graduates to go to our schools that have the most vulnerable students. But at the same time, we don't have mentor teachers to serve students in those schools to get them there so that they learn the skills they need to learn to be successful there. So one question I have about it is, and I believe it's the case that you're limited in the retirement that you can receive, like the dollars that you can receive once you retire, and that's keeping some people from coming back in our system, both through substituting, which I know we also have a huge need for substitute teachers. And so I just wonder, like, is that a law? And then what steps could we take to potentially open a talent pipeline of people who have been in our classrooms but maybe needed to step away and help raise grandchildren but could come back now? Or maybe they've been in our schools and climbed the ladder in our school systems but would like to finish their career in the classroom. I know a couple of instances of people doing that, and just think that we have to figure out a way to get a talent pipeline running to all of our schools, but especially our schools most in need. And so we're just, I'm really interested in opening that conversation and seeing what we need to do. Does that mean we need to work with the legislature to get some laws changed? Because it certainly is a need.
Thank you for those comments. Dr. Davis.
While I completely concur that we need to be thinking about our teacher pipeline and teacher pay, I'd like to point out that these specific proposals before us deal with a shortage of talented theater and talented music and talented art teachers, and we have an accountability system for our teacher education program that penalizes teacher education programs for educating teachers in this particular area with an emphasis on STEM. And I realize that we need STEM and that we have a shortage in STEM, but clearly we have a shortage in the arts as well. And our accountability system actually discourages four-year colleges and four-year universities from educating teachers in the arts through the way we penalize them for failing to meet our needs across the state, which are all related to STEM. So just like to point that out.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention. Other comments? Ms. Boucher?
I think this is reflective of a, like you're saying, it's a much larger issue. We have a shortage of teachers in this state and across our country for many, many, many different reasons. Some is compensation, some I think is lack of respect within communities. There are a lot of difficulties involved. You know, when I first got into the teaching profession, it was very difficult at times to even get a job because it was a well-respected profession and many teachers. We have now created the need for more teachers than we have been on a per capita basis. When we look at stats that say, well, this many teachers retired this year, and if we have this many teachers coming in, it should be no different. But it is different because with the programs that we're putting in, and Ms. Bocky's point, in working with the more challenging settings, there's a need for additional teachers over and above what that student might be getting every day in that classroom. We used to look at, take 25 or 30 kids, put a teacher in there for fun. That's not the case in today's society. So because of the situations that education is dealing with and the community situations, we need for even greater numbers than we had prior to this. The training programs for teachers, they're sorely lacking at the university setting. And what Dr. Davis is saying is accurate. When we have our teacher preparation programs, one of the indicators has to do with placing candidates in not only high-need schools, but in high-need areas that we've identified, to the point of the theater and the arts, that is not considered a high-need area. So teacher prep programs and even private prep programs are not necessarily preparing as many teachers in those areas because we've structured those not to gain points toward being an excellent program. If you do a disproportionate number of these types. We also, in gifted areas, the gifted students, we require not only a certification in gifted, but we require a master's degree in anything plus a certain number of hours in gifted education, which is one of the only areas we require. So it has an elevated requirement for teachers to be certified in those areas. So I do think this bears a lot of looking into. I don't see things getting better. As a superintendent of a local district, we face that. I have never had, and I think I mentioned this at the last meeting, as much of a struggle in adequately staffing our programs as I've had this past year. And I would assume not only with the teacher shortage, but maybe COVID, the whole situation in general. But long term, Mr. Lawrence, as you're saying, 5 years from now, where are we going to be? If we don't evaluate it by now and take a look at what we need to do. We have a resource of retired teachers out there that may not necessarily want to come back and teach full time in these areas. But if we could even fashion the types of jobs and the types of, I guess, the number of hours, amounts of money they can only earn right now coming back as a retired teacher after a waiting period, in most cases, less than, 25% of what their average compensation for retirement is. So if a teacher comes and just takes, a retired teacher even takes maybe a pregnancy replacement or a replacement for a teacher who is having surgery, sometimes that period extends beyond what that teacher is able to do as coming back as a retiree. So right in the middle of that, you've got to change the person. So there's a lot of little things that I think we need to look at that require some legislation, as well as some real thought on how we're going to attract new teachers into the profession and how we're going to train them. So I would be on board as long as we've got something rolling in that area.
Thank you, Ms. Boucher. Thank you, Ms. Boucher. I appreciate those comments also. Other members? All right, I'd like to get a motion, see if we can get a motion from the board. Sorry, to get some other guidance.
For this rate,
Okay, my guidance is we need to address the public comment and motion on the board before we consider a motion to take action on this discussion. So having said that, I've got two comment cards here. The first one is supporting the recommendation, and she wishes to speak. I'm going to need some help with this. I think it's Ms. Posey. Ms. Posey, Ms. Posey, if you would step forward, identify yourself, and I look forward to hearing your comment.
Cynthia Posey with the Louisiana Federation of Teachers. To Dr. Davis's point, I realize that this is about needs of educators, and I appreciate that. I wanted to just make a comment to Dr. Bogey's questions. Everyone knows that we have a teacher shortage. Everyone knows that no one wants to be a teacher now. To your point about the retirees, I really wonder, how many retirees are we going to get back? How many left the profession because of things that were put upon them? There's still a place they're unfair. So what I would say is you can look to what's on your agenda today to find that answer. We have numerous waivers for school boards, for schools, for districts, but are there any waivers for teachers? Did we listen when teachers brought their concerns to you before this and during the legislative session? No one did. If you want people to be teachers, then you have to make them want to be teachers. You're doing everything in your power to make it an undesirable profession. And I think that if we can have honest conversations about that, then I think maybe we stand to do something to make teaching a desired profession, a profession that is something someone can be proud of and that is well thought of. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Posey. I have another card here from Michael Falk. Mr. Falk wishes to speak. Mr. Falk, welcome.
Good morning, sir, and ladies and gentlemen of the board. Michael Falk with the Louisiana Association of School Superintendents. And I serve on the task force that was generated based on a House resolution to look at recruitment and retention of teachers. And it's scary, the information that we have received on the number of people enrolling in the College of Education and actually graduating from the College of Education and getting degrees. What we find is that those numbers have gone down. The number of people that have retired or left the profession since 2011, that number is significant. So you have a big void and jobs available and people available to fill those jobs. We recently conducted a survey on the national level, the National Executive Directors of State Associations. 20 states responded that they are having problems with the retire, rehire, return to work. So it's not just in Louisiana that people are having a problem. That problem can only be solved legislatively. The problem long-term, in reference to your question, Mr. Morris, has to be that we have to work with colleges and universities. We have to work with the College of Education. We have to get people enrolled in those programs, and we have to provide teachers. There are many classrooms today that are being filled by uncertified people. And the ones who ultimately are impacted by that are our children. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. I would just, for the benefit of the board, I'd just like to add to that. I did make an inquiry at LSU where I graduated, and I want to share that information with the board. In 2016-2017, there were 233 graduates from the College of Education at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. It was 233. The following year, the number was 156. The following year, the number was 176, followed by 161. And this last year, the number was 133. So we went back 5 years ago, that number was 233, and most recently it was 133. So it's a significant reduction, and you can see the trend going that direction. So we always happy to get data to support a position. I think there's some really strong data here. Just want to share that with everyone. Got one more comment card this morning, Mr. Marcus Thomas. Marcus would like to speak. Welcome, Marcus.
Hello, Marcus Thomas with LAE, and I'll be brief. We just need to take a look at why the education profession is not desirable as it used to be in Louisiana. Like they mentioned before, the numbers are down at the college level. So the Louisiana Association of Educators, we're really concerned about this recruiting and retention crisis that we're having in the state. And if we do a waiver for retirees to come to work, you know, we need that right now. And that's kind of a temporary fix, but we would like to focus on the fact that on top of that, we need to take a long, hard look at why educators are not coming to the profession at the college level, and while there's a lot of teachers across the state considering not being an educator anymore. They're highly stressed right now. We're going through a pandemic. If we could take a look at what's causing our teachers to not want to choose the profession, and the ones that are there to not want to stay. There's a lot of teachers on the edge right now, and I think that'll be a great idea, and LAE is prepared to be a part of all those conversations, and we're actually working on that because it's actually a crisis going on in the state. So, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Other comments from the board? Mr. Rob?
Looking at this problem from my side of the house and our public side, it's the same thing, even worse for me. In the 10 years that I've been superintendent of the diocese of Louisiana, what I've done to attract teachers, I've tried to do my own. When I find very strong teacher assistants, I have a serious conversation with them about enrolling at LSUA in the alternative program, and I've grown quite a number over 10 years. I just mentioned that as a way, even in the public system, if you find some strong teacher assistants, and if you have a way to assist them in getting certified to become a teacher, it's worth it. Now we have to do it after I agree with this whole conversation. This is a crisis across the country. But in my situation, that has really helped me with throwing some of my own within me. And I've even done the same with administrators. When I find a strong person that I can see administrative qualities in, I do the same thing. I do my best to get them into Northwestern or Louisiana College or wherever, and work with them to get the credentials so that I'll have a pool in time.
Thank you, Mr. Rob. Other comments? Dr. Davis?
So if I, read earlier remarks, Mr. Morris, that you're thinking about the possibility of moving some sort of item to where we look at or assess what's going on in Louisiana as far as teacher training and recruitment into the field. I'd just like for us to also address some of Ms. Posey's remark regarding certified teachers who are leaving the profession, that we don't already do surveys, exit surveys for these teachers as they leave to identify reasons that they're leaving the profession. I'd like for us to start doing that, or even finding a way to survey certified teachers in the state that are not practicing, so that we have some idea about why they are leaving the profession and what we can do to fix those problems.
Thank you. Other members?
We actually do that. When we have an exit survey, comes to the board, we'll have with you.
Great. Thank you. I would love to see that data. I love the data. Thank you.
All right. Superintendent Brown.
Yes, Mr. Morris, I was just going to make mention to the board, if the board isn't aware, that there is a legislatively commissioned teacher recruitment and retention task force presently working on these particular issues. I believe Mr. Falk mentioned earlier he's a member of that task force. I think there are other individuals in the room as well, but on our team, M. Cooper is the representative from our agency on the legislatively commissioned recruitment and retention task force. They are working through a number of these issues. I guess a suggestion I would have would be potentially if there are particular items that this board would like to have explored, maybe the board could suggest that those items be kicked to that task force that's already in existence for them to also take some exploration of those items.
I would respectfully comment that while I would support that approach, my interest, my specific interest is preparing the case for MFP for next year. My experience on this board so far is that I'm not sure how strongly that case has been supported in the past, and I'd like for this year's presentation to include significant data to support the request, and obviously address the points that we discussed this morning. But I'm certainly welcome a conversation from other members about how we should follow up on it.
And as another point, we know that right now, after 5 years, we lose about 50% of our teachers. Between the moment they begin their profession, 5 years later, about half are no longer in the classroom. We know that number is over 60% after 10 years. So retention certainly is a struggle that has to be explored. And for a kid, there's nothing more important than a quality teacher in the classroom. I mean, that is beyond every program that we could ever imagine. Number one is having a quality teacher with the child.
Agree 100%. Other thoughts from members about how we would approach this going forward? Ms. Castillo?
Just a quick question, and I should probably know the answers to this, but in keeping with Ms. Posey's comments and what Dr. Brummer just said, curious top 5 reasons, why we aren't recruiting or retaining. And I'm sure there's a list somewhere maybe that task force can produce, but I'd be curious to know a little bit more detail. Is it in our packet, President Holloway?
No, but you're along the same lines that I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Really good point. And I don't want to put down on the spot, but if you don't mind, Mr. Morris, I love your presentation and your request, but it's the House bill with Mincy caused the task force to be developed. I'd like Ms. Cooper to share briefly what's happening in the task force and what will the outcome be? And I think that may be answered as well as something else on that.
So the task force,
Ms. Cooper, if you would please identify yourself for the rest of the
sure, M. Cooper, Deputy Assistant Superintendent of Educator Development. The task force was created this past session. We've had 3 meetings so far, and actually this December, during the joint Board of Regents and BESE meeting, we'll have an update to share with you all about what's been done so far. But The task force is designed to create recommendations for both the Board of Regents, so for the higher ed side, and for LDOE, aligned to recruitment and retention efforts. Those recommendations are being created along the lines of what is best practice across the country, what we're seeing in other states that are really good models around recruitment and retention, and how we can bring those to Louisiana. And so the task force is a 2-year-long task force, but we will begin some of those recommendations this December once the task force votes, and then we'll continue to add recommendations over the next 2 years. So it is an ongoing set of recommendations that will be delivered to both Board of Regents and us. But I would say overall, a lot of your questions are questions that we've talked about at the task force and have had ourselves. I think just a couple things for you all to know is some of the recommendations include in the recruitment area are around our pre-educator pathway work. So how can we increase that across the state so that our high schools are having students in the pre-educator pathway, which is the Grow Your Own, which someone mentioned earlier, and then how we're getting them to the college or career path and education. There's also a foundational recommendation around data collection. So unfortunately, a lot of the questions that were asked in the legislation around recruitment and retention are either not the easiest data pull, or we currently don't collect it in some form or fashion. So a lot of those recommendations will be around how do we create a more robust data collection process at LDOE so that we can use that data to then drive some of the recommendations and decisions that we make around recruitment and retention. Another recommendation is around doing a compensation study and creating a strategy around compensation and incentive models for our districts and across our state, so talking about MFP earlier. And then we have some other recruitment areas such as expanding our human resources fellowship, which is specific to the human capital leaders of districts and how they can implement strong recruitment and retention strategy for their system. So those are just a couple things, but I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that. I know you're also on the task force.
And for the board to note that this presentation, besides BESE receiving it, that you'll present or submit to the legislature your findings.
Correct.
In January.
Correct. And at the end of the 2-year term as well.
With my interpretation here, it seems to be that this is more of a longer-term deliverable. You mentioned reference to 2 years for this task force. So I want to be clear here. Are we talking about a longer-term deliverable versus what we had discussed previously would be more of a short-term concern for the MFP for 2022?
I think it's both. Some of those recommendations are more short-term and some have a longer-term strategy. And the set of recommendations that are going to December are ones that we would start now. Any additional recommendations over the 2 years would begin then. But I think for the recommendations going to December, a lot of them are things we can implement this school year and hopes to have some improvement over the next year or two.
Okay, so from your experience and I guess your expectations for the meeting tomorrow with Board of Regents at BESE, there's potential there that we could set some expectation that that group would provide some input to BESE for building the case for MFP for 2022?
I think that'd be great.
So we're doing right.
Just as a point of clarity, that's a December meeting between BESE and Board of Regents, not tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. But you would support that approach?
Yes.
Dr. Bowman?
Ms. Cooper, have y'all talked about retirees?
We actually had a representative from TRSL come to the last meeting and share about the different laws around that, how that's impacting school systems. And I think that that was a big question that the task force had because there's a lot of, I guess, misconceptions about it or just lack of understanding about the whole process. And so we started our last meeting with a presentation shared by them that they are included and will be involved in some of this work.
Okay. Could you forward that presentation to me that you received from TRSL? And I I really am interested in, like, I don't know that this is something that your task force wants to get deep into relative to what we would have to do relative to legislation to make it possible. But I am interested in figuring out who might be interested in championing that and working towards it. I agree, I think it's really important that we have the task force. I'm looking forward to y'all's presentation in December. But I also think there are some like short-term things that we could put in place that I think when the legislation was created, it was done, you know, for what people thought was best at the time, and that we're living in a different world now and need to address how our world has changed. So, and I get it. I mean, maybe not a whole bunch of people would want to come back, but when you think of the power of one teacher who may be interested, and I want principals to have choice, right? Like, I don't want them to feel like they're just hiring someone. I want them to feel like they're hiring the best person for the students that they have.
Sure. I'll forward that to you.
Thank you, Dr. Vogel. Members, any other comments? Okay, thank you, Cooper, for your comments, and we look forward to hearing your report in December. Members, I'm going to ask you to repeat the motion that's on the floor right now, just so we're clear on what's on the table, if you would.
The motion on the floor is that consideration of request from LEAs for waivers of policy contained in Bulletin 1706 for the 2021-2022 school year submitted by the State Superintendent of Education. The recommendation that is on the floor this time is to approve the waiver of policy in Bulletin 1706 submitted by Tangipahoa Parish School System and St. Mary Parish School System as outlined.
Any opposed? Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes. Thank you. Next slide.
Before I read the next item, I was asked to let our board members know that the Claiborne building is in the process of redoing all of the technology in this boardroom. They have not completed that yet. We do have the new lights that are much more sensitive up here. They're still working to finish down there. And they're still tweaking the system, so when you are not speaking, if you would put the mics down instead of up, it would help with the feedback problems with it. And also, the control system is a little different, but you also have the ability to control your microphone and turn it on and off as well. The next item is on page 11, item 2.2, consideration of an update report regarding a kindergarten through second grade accountability framework. The department recommendation is to receive.
Motion to receive, please. Mr. Garland, second. Ms. Holloway, thank you. Mr. Brown.
Yes, sir, Mr. Morris. This will just be a brief verbal report around the potential K-2 accountability system. As you all are very well aware, we have tried to eliminate the literacy crisis that we're facing in our state over the last couple of years by providing data points to communicate the need that we have in our state and the need for reading revival. If you look at the number of students who are scoring at that mastery level by the end of third grade on reading, I believe that number is 46%. If you look at NAEP at the end of fourth grade, the percent students proficient is 26%. So we know that we have to do a number of things from teacher training, pre-service programs to teacher training, administrative training of practicing professionals, to access to books for kids, to standard protocols around interventions and screeners, and we just have a lot of work to do here, and we are engaged actively in that work. And I'm really excited about some of the work that our team is doing with this particular need. One of those pieces that also should be included, we believe, is a K-2 accountability component, and that would also help us comply with Act 438 of the last legislative session, which requires us to have an accountability formula in place for K-2. So, Mr. Morris, we just wanted the board to know that we are continuing to work to ensure that we can bring forward to the board a K2 accountability model that we think makes sense in order to help improve outcomes for our kids in their foundational years into their future.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Got one comment card here. Dr. Janet Post. She supports the recommendation and she'd like to speak. Dr. Post.
Good morning. Janet Pope, Louisiana School Boards Association, and we stand in support of the state moving forward with this mechanism to provide K2 accountability. We have come to the Accountability Commission meetings and to this board many times to advocate and support for this. Our position and the position of our membership has not changed. And so today we come to the table again to emphasize our comments provided at the last meeting. Our membership has expressed overwhelming support of including K2 as a component of school and district accountability. Moving forward, the LSBA hopes to see continuous support for literacy and early intervention through standardized literacy assessment that is aligned to the grade 3 assessment. By providing alignment in an important part of annual assessments, again, alignment is key. We also hope to see vertical alignment for growth processes as well, for their purposes. The LSBA has been vocal in the past and remains vocal about the need for numeracy to be assessed with the same depth and values as literacy. Numeracy is critical to the future success of student outcomes. We also remain committed to the premise that early learning assessment and growth should take priority in early measures of accountability. We suspect that students performing well on assessments are well served by their classroom environments. With the ongoing conversations about future changes in accountability, it is important to keep K2 at the forefront of all of our discussions. We support the department's move towards including K2 in accountability, and we urge BESE to move forward with its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Post. Members, any comments? Mr. Garvey?
Yes, I'd like to highlight something that the superintendent mentioned. I don't remember hearing much talk about this before, but it has to do with the legislature expressing its support for the work that the department is doing on this issue. Senate Bill 222 by Senator Hewitt, which became Act 438 that the superintendent mentioned, shows the legislature's support for our movement in this and the governor's support as he signed the bill. So,
Thank you.
point that out. Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Dr. Bowley?
What's the timeline requirements for the bill?
Dr. Pope, yeah, I would have to go back and look, but I do not believe it is set forward a specific time period for implementation, just that it needs to exist. I'm sure that, when we go back to the table in upcoming sessions, we'll be questioned about status on this, but I don't believe there's a specific timeline outlined. To Mr. Garvey's point, though, the legislature, as he mentioned, has really been supportive of all the efforts that we've undertaken around literacy, and they are sharing their equal commitment to try and help us solve this challenge.
Maybe we can clarify your request a little bit, Dr. Bowley. I recall a previous presentation that might have been specific to literacy, where there was a timeline, there was a learning year, and then implementation was 23, 24.
Right, so that was a timeline that the department developed for implementation of the accountability program that we had recommended. It was not necessarily to align with a timeline of Act 438. It was a timeline that we felt was an appropriate implementation schedule of the formula that we've developed.
And then Dr. Bowley?
That's good.
Members, other comments? All right, anyone opposed to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
The next item will be taken out of order. This is item 5.1 on page 23. Consideration of revisions to Bulletin 111, Louisiana School District and State Accountability System regarding Strength of Diploma Index, Alternative School Accountability, and ACT Work Keys Index. The department recommendation is to receive the report.
Motion to receive, please.
So moved.
Dr. Bophy, second, Mr. Castillo. Thank you. Superintendent Brown.
Mr. Morris, I guess on this particular motion, not motion, on this particular item, what I would share is that we attempted over the last year to be very open in the 2 years worth of work of the dual enrollment task force, of trying to push additional dual enrollment courses into our high schools in a collaborative way between university partners and K-12. As well as thinking about the potential through the MFP dollars to support students earning an associate's degree prior to their exit for high school. Just as an example, if we had 5% of our graduates earn, say, an associate's degree, just 5%, annually that would be about 2,200 students. So we would have about 2,200 students if we saw 5% of our kids earn an associate's degree. If we saw 10%, that number, of course, doubles. We could go up from there. What we know is the interest in the work has certainly shifted, and for most of our students, a high school degree alone is not going to be enough for them to be successful overall. That was true at one point in time, but now more and more students need a credential, an associate's degree, and a 4-year degree. And if we're talking about associate's degree in particular, what you will see from the Census Bureau is that over the course of a student's lifetime, a student who earns a high school degree versus a student who at least earns an associate's degree, the student who earns an associate's degree will see $400,000 of additional earnings over their lifetime. And that's a Census Bureau stat. So our goal has simply been, rethinking that high school experience to incentivize the behaviors that we think are worthwhile in our schools. And so those were some of the recommendations that we put forward and we worked through over the course of the year with the Accountability Commission. Obviously, as we move through the process, additional concerns, I think, overall with the accountability system became there became additional concerns brought forward with the accountability system as a whole. And I'll give you an example of some of the things that I've heard and have tried to listen to. Our accountability system has been in place for a couple of decades. Over time, various tweaks and revisions have been made year over year. And potentially now the system isn't solving or serving students and communities in the way that we all might like it to serve our students and our communities. Some of the concerns that I've heard, many are legitimate. One is the growth methodology and how we're awarding points for growth and the calculation of the way that is made. Maybe that's not the most appropriate formula. And in fact, if you explore that, or I believe that there are certainly areas where that can be improved. Another area that we have heard consistently over the last couple of months has to do with high school potential inflation of high school scores and maybe underrepresentation in elementary and middle. So for instance, we have about 40+% of our elementary and middle schools that are A and D, and that number jumps up to about 70% at the high school level that are A and D. So there is a difference, and one could argue that, and rightfully so, that the purposes of an elementary and middle school versus the purpose of a high school are different things. But there also could be an argument that similarly, the value and the way in which an accountability model explores those two should be even. So I think that's probably an area that we're also going to have to explore. We have also heard some level of concern around is a 150-point scale the type of scale that is most beneficial moving forward. So I just think that, we might come forward today and say, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z, and we believe there's a ton of value for students in doing X, Y, and Z, and I do. When I talk about some of the numbers that I've just shared of value that I believe we're leaving on the table for students. But, you know, I think in the larger scheme, we probably should, and our kids and our schools deserve us having additional conversation around what this accountability formula looks like comprehensively, how the different components engage with each other, so that we can get the results that our kids need and deserve. You know, it became somewhat of a challenge for me as, you know, a superintendent coming in and having board members who have served for some time building the formula and being a part of that, and to call out specific aspects of that and not knowing maybe where everyone might be. But I think as the conversation has evolved, I've certainly learned more about various feelings about the formula, how it stands, and things that we might should consider to bolster it, to move it into the future. So that's why we simply are making the recommendation here, Mr. Morris, that we continue to evaluate the formula, and just so the board would know that as we move forward, we are going to be especially interested in incentivizing the attainment at the high school level of some of those options that I previously discussed, whether it's apprenticeships, where out of 40,000 graduates 2 years ago, we had 9 students, you count on 2 hands, who have a full apprenticeship, or associate's degrees where we had 150 out of 40,000 students. I mean, we just have to do better. And we want to be a part of incentivizing that, but also at the same time making sure that our accountability system reflects and gives the public an accurate appreciation of the schools and their communities. So that's what we'll be working on, or that's our intent, to continue to work on that over the next few months.
Thank you, sir. Superintendent Bowman, could you help us with one other aspect that we consider this, and that is the time that the local districts as well as your team needs to implement these proposed changes. In fact, BESE were to approve them. How long does that take, so we can appreciate the timeline for implementation?
Well, our last meeting of BESE approved the appointment of, or BESE approved rather, a procedure where the board president would appoint 3 members to a subcommittee that would work with some national experts where we would contract with a facilitator where we would contract, and we would work through concerns maybe with the growth formula, what is working, maybe what is not working, what are national best practices. Because I think as we talk about the growth piece, we want to make sure that we have something that's very clear for teachers. And I don't know the degree or the percentage of teachers right now that could explain to you how their growth formula is calculated, or principles. And so I would think with that particular piece, we would want something that is possible to be easily communicated and simplified. So we have that. When we're talking about the high school timeline, there are 2 different timelines to discuss. One would be a timeline to make a recommendation on a proposal. And then the second piece is how much time do high schools need to react and make any adjustments as a result of that recommendation or potential approved policy change. When you're talking about how we calculate growth, I think we all have an expectation that at least in a year, we want our children to grow academically 1 year for a year's worth of instruction. So we know that, we expect that. The high school piece is more of a multi-year process, because if you're going to say that you want a student with a credential, a certain credential, it might be a multi-year process. If you're talking about an associate's degree or an apprenticeship, it might be a multi-year process. And so high schools have to have the opportunity to think about their staffing, their scheduling, their finances, and their partnerships. And that is not something that they can do overnight.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. Ms. O'Shea.
I've been a member of the Little Norfolk Task Force for the last 2 years. We did an extensive study on dual enrollment, class AP, IBCs, the 4-year colleges, the 2-year colleges, how do we get kids to access it, how do we prepare kids for life after high school, being a productive member of society. And one of the recommendations that we came out with was to tie some of these experiences in our accountability board and recognize these achievements within it. I think as we look at this high school component of accountability, the basic tenet we have to understand and realize that I think the mission of our high school is going to be a little different than the mission of our K-8 program. When that 9th grader walks into our high school, he or she walks in with a set of life experiences and a set of educational experiences. And that child's going to be all over the map. So what that high school has to do, what we have to do, is to refocus. What are our goals? What do we look at? How do we reward that achievement? What are we looking for that high school student? I think we're looking for successful completion of high school, but with skills that are going to make that child a productive member of our society, a tax-paying member, a member who has a realistic view of getting a good job so that he or she can support his or her family. And when we look at these things, we also have to look at it through an equity lens as well, what we did with the dual enrollment task force. When that child walks in as a 9th grader, it's almost like an individualized plan. What are we going to do for that child? And we've got to reward the attainment of IBCs, the attainment of dual enrollment credit. It's most important within our most challenged communities. Because if our kids in high school can make these achievements, can earn these credentials, or earn the college credit within that protected high school environment, the support that's there is going to help his or her persistence level as he pursues it beyond high school. So I think we've got to look through it through a very different lens than we look at our K-8 accountability. So I would hope that when we study this, we're not doing it just from I don't know, the 2025 assessment lens. We look at it through a life lens of what we want to do for that child, or when that child graduates high school, what we can do for him or her as he moves out into the community. Because if the support isn't there in high school for our most challenging students, what we see time and time again is their failure to attain at the next level. So please, we've got to look at the high school as a different definition. We've got to look through it, add it through an equity lens, and be very careful in how we incentivize programs at the high school.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Other members? Mr. Castillo?
Thank you, Mr. Morris. I've got a motion that I'd like to make, but let me preface that motion with a few comments, and that is the work of the Accountability Commission and the department. I applaud that work, and Superintendent, I know how hard you work. I look at your staff here in the audience, and I know how hard they've worked as well. We've also had a number of stakeholders that many of us have engaged with and expressed interest and concerns. We've heard your comments over the last few months, and so we do think it's appropriate, as the superintendent and the department recommends, that we take an opportunity to look at this very, very carefully and be comprehensive in our review of this. And I think it was maybe Ms. Polk that referenced with respect to our K-2 proposed accountability framework, that we have vertical alignment throughout not just K-2, but all the way through high school. We really want to make sure we get all of this right. And so what I'd like to offer, in keeping with the timeline proposed of August 2022 to bring back proposed revisions to the bulletin, is that we expand, this would be a substitute motion, I take it, Mr. Morris, because there's a motion to receive that's currently on the floor. But the substitute motion will be not only that we receive the report, but that we expand the previously appointed work group or committee that's already in place that is going to work with the department and other stakeholders as it relates to growth, but expand the charge of that committee to also include the K-2 accountability framework as well as the accountability framework for local, district, and the state accountability systems.
Thank you, sir. Other members like to comment?
And high school, of course.
Okay. Mr. Garvey, do we have a second?
I think Ms. Holloway seconded it.
Ms. Holloway? Okay. Any opposition to the motion? Thank you. Mr. Garvey?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on something the superintendent mentioned. I'm in full support of the motion and looking at this as a comprehensive piece. We talked about this, I think, at the last meeting, the need to look at this comprehensively, and I think it's really the way to go. The superintendent mentioned that some people might be surprised that some of the people who worked on the original version, if you could call it that, of the accountability system, might think that it needs to be changed. And I would point out that really should not be a surprise. It was there when we were working on it originally, or a long time ago, maybe it was not the original version. But I think we all knew, everybody that was working on it, that this is a work in progress. That from time to time, no matter how good you get it the first time, there's always improvement that can be made to the system. So even though we had strong support for the system that is in place now, when we originally passed it, many of the people who were there then realized that we can improve it today, that it needs to be improved, and that, in fact, our focus has changed somewhat. We are now much more focused on, as the superintendent said, achieving college credits while our students are in high school. So that's just an example of how things have changed, how the whole system needs to be looked at because of those changes. So there's one person who was here that really supported the original version, and I would also like to say I'm very much excited and full support of looking at this comprehensively.
Thank you, Mr. Garvey. Other members? Hi. Dr. Garvey?
So, I like being able to turn my mic off, by the way. What I have to say about this is, like Mr. Garvey, I don't think we've ever perfected accountability, right? I don't think anybody's ever perfected accountability anywhere, to be honest with you. I will say, I think like some context for people is, if you look at Singapore, so Singapore is a country that does extremely well in education, organized a lot different than we are, right? Like their governance structure and all that, very, very different. But what's fascinating is that they've moved on from accountability. So they had an accountability system before, but they've moved beyond an accountability system to the point to where their focus is on improvement. And they have practices in place for continuous improvement. So I do think that's something that we should aspire to for the sake of, in our education system, the accountability system was built for a purpose, right? And that purpose was to improve schools. And while none of us would say we are where we want to be, right? We are not where we want to be. We've made improvements over the last couple of decades that the accountability system should be in place. And I think the struggle with this is that you have different people who want to accomplish different things, and they get laser focused on the one thing that they want to accomplish. And so I would encourage any commission or committee or task force that's looking at this to keep in mind the overall purpose, right? And I would encourage especially the members of the board who are gonna work on the committee for this, to think about that overall North Star, which for me is about continuing to improve the system, right? Because we're not Singapore at this point. Maybe we'll be at a point where we don't need accountability one of these days. But in my mind, that purpose is for us to always be thinking about how we can better serve kids. And so I would love to see the BESE members who are part of that committee to continue to have conversations with other board members, right? Because this isn't work that all 11 of us can do on a full-time basis. But I do want the people who are focused on it to continue to think about how do we create a system that when people are paying attention to the system, they better serve students, right? And so that's my hope, is that we continue to get to that point. And I'll say that, like, accountability is not my passion. My passion is connected to educator talent and continuous improvement and those kinds of things. But I do think that it does have the power to improve. And, even we were just talking about K2. So in my own personal life, I experienced kindergarten as a parent 9.5 years ago. So my son is now in high school, but now I'm experiencing it again, right? Because this big gap in age of my own kids, and I'm experiencing kindergarten again. And I can tell you, it's improved. So there's been incremental steps that we've made. I think the struggle in our state is that we're so far behind because of our level of poverty, because of the fact that for a long time people have been uneducated and it hasn't been a priority in our state. But I do think that we need to continue to focus on how can we make incremental improvements, and for the kids who need it most, how can we make exponential improvements, right? Because Dr. Brumley brought up, 1 year of growth isn't going to get some of our kids where they need to be. For some kids, they need to get more than a year of growth out of their learning. And these are the same kids that if we had the teachers we needed to serve them, then we wouldn't need an accountability system, right? But we're not there. And so I think we've got to figure out how to continue to put these pieces together to make it happen. And again, I'm not going to be on the committee, but I want the committee members to keep in mind, how do you create a system so that when educators are paying attention to it, they serve kids even better?
Thank you, Dr. Bowlby. Mr.
Oh,
Castillo?
one more thing. I do have another issue, Mr. Morris, that is related to accountability,
Yes, ma'am.
but it's connected more to accountability for students that I can hold until we vote on this, or I can present now if you want me to. It's up to you.
Please continue.
Okay. So our current seniors, their last normal year of school was as a freshman. We have accountability when it comes to graduation. And I have a concern, and I don't know the scale of this concern, so I'm gonna have to ask the department what it's like statewide. But I have a concern that we have more students at risk to graduate right now because the pandemic started when they were sophomores. And in order to graduate, students have to pass an EOC in English 1 or English 2, in algebra or geometry, and then in biology or US history. Did I get that right, Superintendent? Okay. So the one that I think puts students most at risk is the biology and US history. And you can see that in our statewide results. And I just want to know, what can we do for the next, I don't know, what do we have, like 7 months of school left? What can we do over the next 7 months to make sure that the student's experience isn't future altering, right? Because the majority of their high school experience has been in a pandemic. And so I just want to raise that because I have educators talking to me about it, and I just feel like we as a board should be talking about it.
Superintendent Brown?
When I utilize my on-off button, she referred to, Dr. Moore. One of the ways that we dealt with this last year is we did, I don't know if you recall, we did the waivers for the seniors who were in some specific need. But my offer to you at this point is, as an agency, we'll go back and we'll try to make a determination of the status of what you're asking to get a better sense before December.
Okay. And can you report that back to us outside of the meeting? Because I think that it's going to impact just directions for what, how students are going to spend their last semester in school. So, and maybe if the two of us could even follow up on it individually would probably be helpful.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Castillo.
I just wanted to follow up, Mrs. Morris, in terms of the committee that we're putting in place. And the point of it, in part, is to be inclusive. Following some of our prior meetings, we're having various conversations, wonderful conversations, with various stakeholder groups that brought up some great points. And the reason for extending this process is to have additional engagement. So there's kind of a defined group of folks who are in the audience that are paying attention to all of this, which we're all grateful for. And at least in my opinion, Mr. Morris, the hope would be that when this committee begins its work, that all who have information, data, specific suggestions, that you bring this to this committee of the board and to the department so that we can synthesize it all and then turn all that back into hopefully what will be some very helpful recommendations as to a revised, modified accountability framework. So for anyone out there who's saying, how do I participate? This is really set up to garner more participation and support to the extent that anyone did not feel included. But more importantly, if you have helpful information for us to consider, we absolutely want to have that.
Mr. Morris, may I respond? Mr. Castillo, to that point, we've mentioned a few times that we would have a facilitator that would facilitate this process, and one of our asks of the facilitator, specifically in an expanded role potentially now under this motion, will be interviews with all of the various organized groups, as well as to the extent possible that we can be inclusive, so that data can be collected in a formal procedural way.
Great, wonderful.
Thank you, gentlemen. Other comments from the board before we go to public comment? All right, we've got two cards here. First, Mr. Gordon Ford. Mr. Ford wishes to speak.
Good morning. Gordon Ford, Executive Director of Lincoln Preparatory School, where 21% of our students earned associate degrees last year. Glad to be with you. On September 7th, I forwarded an email to Superintendent Brumlin. The email was from a school counselor at a neighboring school regarding a student that had transferred to Lincoln Prep. The student was entering the 11th grade, and the counselor informed me that the student was a Jump Start student. Upon reviewing the student's record, I found that the student had a 3.25 GPA and scored basic on his English 2 assessment. I then contacted the counselor to request a copy of the student's IGP to confirm parental selection of the Jump Start pathway. The counselor sent me an IGP sound by the parent at the start of the 9th grade year, selecting the Tufts University pathway. When I inquired as to why the student was moved to a Jump Start pathway, the counselor told me that while the students are supposed to formally choose their pathway in April of the 10th grade, the decision to move with Jump Start was really made by the student when he chose standard level classes for 9th and 10th grades. Students intending to stay on the Tufts University pathway are required to take college prep honors classes. It turns out that the mother never consented to moving her child off the Tufts University pathway. The student is now a junior at Lincoln Prep in our early college academy and will graduate next year with an associate degree. This story has a happy ending, but most do not. This student, like countless others, was moved to a Jump Start pathway without his parents' consent or knowledge. One of the effects of moving students to a Jump Start pathway prior to 11th grade is to avoid placing the student in a geometry course. That way, the student is not counted in the school's math assessment or the math progress index, potentially raising the SPS of those schools. I'm telling you this because it's happening now. The proposal regarding ACT would take it to another level because our accountability system was assigned zeros to several of our students. And there are more incentives for schools to move those kids out of their SPS than it is to work with those kids and try and improve those kids' outcomes. And so as we look at our accountability system moving forward, and I appreciate what Superintendent Brumley is trying to do, to close loopholes and to take away negative incentives. We have got to take away the incentives that exist in our accountability system to move poor and minority kids out of the calculation, and in some cases out of the school, just to keep the school improvement scores up.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Wendy Baldwin, who wishes to speak. Dr. Baldwin.
Wendy Bowman on behalf of the Louisiana School Boards Association. At previous BESE meetings, there have been proposals to make changes to certain portions of the accountability system. Today, no recommendation for change in the accountability formula is being proposed. Instead, this board is being asked to receive the information that has been collected thus far. The Louisiana School Boards Association has been following and participating in the Accountability Commission meetings and at this board since these discussions began over a year ago. Our organization has long advocated for an accountability system in Louisiana that is aligned, continuous, and equitable. While there are parts of the system that meet those criteria, the system as a whole does not. There have been a number of comments related to concerns about accountability at the commission meetings and at this body from various educational stakeholders. And though the stakeholder groups may not all agree on the details, it has become clear that we all agree that something should be done about the accountability system in Louisiana. It may no longer represent the values that we have for our students and what we desire their outcomes to be at each portion of the educational process. Today, as our association has before, we are asking this board to consider whether the current system of accountability remains the best method of communicating school and district performance to our communities. Now might be the best time for change. The association would like to thank the department and their leadership in moving forward and trying to make accountability changes, and this board for being open to considering aggregate changes to the system as a whole, as we are now in a different place than we were when these discussions first began. We would also like to thank Mr. Castile for his comments about including other educational stakeholders in BESE's work as they move forward. The LSBA is here to serve as a resource. I have worked in accountability in this state since 2008 and am happy to serve in any capacity to assist and provide information and be part of those conversations. We'd also like to thank Mr. Ford for his comments. We've been following his comments through BESE as he advocates on behalf of the school system as well. We thank you for your time and appreciate the discussions moving forward about accountability.
Thank you, Dr. Baldwin. Members, before we move on, Mr. Castille's motion, is there any other discussion? All right, Ms. Landry, if you could repeat the motion, the substitute motion on the floor for us. Ms. Ross.
If the motion is to receive and direct the department to expand the accountability work group charge to include K2 framework as well as the local and state accountability. For growth.
Yeah, did we get the high school component on there?
Everything.
Just want to confirm that.
Comprehensive K-12.
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 Yes, it's to include K2 along with the other.
Can you be specific? Can you please read it?
As
Specific.
well as the local and state accountability for high school. Is that what you want to have? You might need to repeat it.
Yeah, we could just repeat it for clarity, just to make sure we get it right.
To direct the department to expand the accountability work group charge to include K-2 framework as well as the local and state accountability for growth index to include the high school accountability. Is that correct, Mr. Cassidy?
No, not quite, let me take a shot at it. And that is, move that we expand the charge of the previously formed work group to not only address growth in the accountability system, but to also include K through 12 accountability. That way we get it all.
And can we add a timeline, please? I did question August 22, but we can support on a timeline.
Yeah, in the recommendation that I stated it earlier, but in the packet, the superintendent of the department recommends that we come back with proposed revisions no later than August 2022. I'd like that to remain in the motion.
So if the committee completes the work earlier, Dr. Drummond, then you can bring it in June or so. Thank you.
Ms. Ross, you want to give it a shot?
I think you summed it up.
We got it. We'll go back and listen.
We're gonna have to go back and listen.
Okay, all right. Members, with that on the table, is there any opposition to the substitute motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
The next item is on page 12, item 3.1, consideration of an update report regarding the summer learning program survey results. The department recommendation is to receive the report. Backup documentation has been distributed.
Motion to receive, please. Mr. Garvey, second. Dr. Bowman.
Mr. Morris, we'll just provide a brief verbal report on this. First of all, I'm just so appreciative of systems around the state for the way that they responded to rethinking what summer programs could look like across the state. And I think we served our children in a much more effective way than in previous years with the way in which summer was carved out this particular year. In fact, we recently recognized the East Louisiana school system earlier in the week as being a model of excellence of what summer programming could look like across the state, and we'll be recognizing them again, I believe, tomorrow. But a few just points I'd like to share about summer programming of the last year. We had 57% of our systems offering summer programming to kindergarten, 84% offering to students in 1st through 8th grade, 68% offering programming to 9th through 12th grade. On average, the summer learning program spent 3 to 4 hours per day on core content, and then enrichment or elective activities beyond that. 87% of school systems utilize teacher recommendation and student grades to determine eligibility for summer programs. Furthermore, when we're thinking about elective and enrichment opportunities, primary opportunities were STEM, arts, and well-being activities for students beyond the core instruction or core tutoring. So we thought we had a really successful summer program across the state this last year, learned some lessons, and fully expect to see that continue over the next few years. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Members? Dr. Brown, I have a couple questions. The first one, I was curious with the outstanding turnout that we have with regard to students, how do we handle staffing for this?
So staffing was a challenge in several places, and so one of the things I know that systems did, I think rightfully so, increase the pay rates that they pay their instructional staff for working in summer programming to a more attractive rate for teachers to be compensated, which I think that was really a smart and wise decision, especially considering the stress of the past school year. In some places they worked with community organizations such as recreational centers and nonprofits. Some places they worked with their local colleges and universities. In some places they used high school students to support some of the elective and enrichment opportunities. So just there's no simple, easy answer to say here's the area where staffing came from, but it came from a number of different locations.
Okay, so basically, you and your team brought forth what I thought was a pretty cool concept, and the way you presented this is a fun initiative as opposed to summer school, and then you have the funding available. So is this something that you would consider for next summer, or is this just a one-time shot?
No, and in fact, if you look at our Louisiana Comeback Plan, the second key endeavor, key initiative of the Louisiana Comeback Plan is recovery and acceleration. Recovery and acceleration has a couple of different components under that, tutoring as well as after-school and before-school programs, and then summer programming. So all systems had to submit their Louisiana Comeback Plan to the department by the end of September. We're going through a multi-score review of those plans right now, trying to give feedback to the systems. But one of the things we are looking for, and it's not a tough ask. I mean, systems are also excited about this. They value this. They appreciate having the funding to do this. So we anticipate seeing this again this upcoming summer of 22.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Holler?
Yes, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to ask about or talk about is would belong here, but I would think it would be because of the, we're looking at keeping skilled kids in school and to improve their outcomes. And it has to do with learning pods. And a part of could be the summer learning, or it could be at any time during the school day. And the reason why I want to bring this up, and hopefully I can, because of how we move forward with instruction and learning at different times, and for districts to be creative. And Dr. Brumley, you and I made a visit at one of the local schools in my area, and that's Max Charter, who is transforming their instruction, their teaching, their learning, and learning pods is one of the creative ways of improving their learning. So, and I was quite impressed when I visited there, because they are developing and implementing the COBBS model on the learning pod. So it kind of sparked my interest in thinking about what happened this past legislative session with the bills that have passed. And one of them, and I think Mr. Leger, you are part of this with the legislative session. And I'm not quite sure who's going to answer what I'm going to ask, but it may possibly be you. Ms. Emerson, with House Bill 421, brought forth the Learning Pod bill, and it was passed, and it turned out to be 400. So in my research, I went back to my paperwork, and I think it was Mr. Morrison that had this paperwork for us that gave us updates. And the update is showing that, and that's one of my first questions, no action at this time versus where there are other legislative acts that have passed that say no action needed. So my first question is, can you explain the difference between no action at this time versus no action needed? Can I call up Mr. Leger, or?
Superintendent Roman, would you like to speak to that, or call Mr. Leger?
Dr. Leger can come to the table. Could you tell me a little bit more about what are you talking about in terms of the board codifying policy around something?
Well, it's underneath the BESE Plan of Action for August 2021. So I just I'm questioning the difference. No action at this time. What does that mean versus no action needed? And then I want to ask, where are we on that?
Keith Leger, Assistant Superintendent Department. I guess I'm not real clear of the question.
The question here in the packet that was given to us, it indicates Julie Emerson, House Bill 421, it's Act 400, authorized public school governing authorities to establish learning pods for the purpose of providing small group instruction for students enrolled in public schools, which I think this is a great instructional tool for delivery of instruction. So the question is, it indicates no action at this time. What does that mean?
It means that as of now, there's no action that is required of BESE at the time.
So what about the department? I understood with this bill that the department would take the lead with guidelines or items that would help instruct or deliver to districts for them to move forward with creating this teaching and learning? Has there been anything?
Yeah, without
that's been
having the
created?
bill directly in front of me, I'm just going from memory, is that the learning pod definition would be placed in statute. And that this is an option that that districts have always had the option of doing this. What Ms. Emerson did with the bill was simply to further define or in detail define what a learning pod is and to place that in statute. And so we'll go back and take a second look at it, and I'll get with Ethan and follow up with you on that.
Yeah, it's a question of have guidelines been developed, Johnny knows, have guidelines been developed and disseminated to districts? And if so, can the board members have a copy? I'm not quite sure, but what's out there? What do districts know about learning pods and how to develop them? Is this part of the responsibility here?
So you're,
What does it mean by no action?
So President Holloway, you're wanting us to, and I understand the question now, you're wanting us to go in and develop additional information about the learning pod opportunities that systems have, how they might could operate, what they look like, and provide that to school systems.
Yes, I'm asking, but I assume that that would be a piece of what you would do for our district. So that's why action, no action told me, well, maybe the department hasn't developed anything, and do districts have anything to follow?
No, we have not developed learning pod guidance for school systems. We have not done that. We can make that information available to them.
Well, if it's an act, is this something the department's responsible for? I just need to help
Yeah,
me.
not necessarily. I mean, acts of the legislature, happen when they happen, and every single act doesn't necessarily require the department to go in and notify school systems on exactly how that might look within their organization. But we're certainly open in this particular case if you'd like us to do something like that.
Yeah, we'd like that, because I'm just, I'm hearing about literacy and you're developing that, and that is an act. So why not learning pods, or why not others? But this one really kind of made me a red flag because of no actions. I just question. And I'm hearing that there are some areas, pockets in Louisiana that are developing these learning pods within their schools, which is amazing that they're being creative and out of box with their needs for their schools. So what are we doing to help in that area? And I would like action taken.
Thank you.
Dr. Brown, you'll follow up with Ms. Hall on that?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Dr. Brown, thank you for that update on summer school. Look forward to hearing about it again next year. Members, if there's no objection to the motion, hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
The next item is on page 15, item 4.2, consideration of an update report regarding the continuous learning task force. The department recommendation is to approve the final report of the CLTF.
Motion to approve. Can I get a motion, please? Mr. Mallory, a second. Dr. Davis, thank you.
Mr. Morris, Ms. Cooper will present this report. She's a member of this task force.
Okay, great. Anna Cooper, Deputy Assistant Superintendent of Educator Development. So in your packet, you have a copy of the report from the Continuous Learning Task Force, but I do want to just voice over what the Continuous Learning Task Force has done over the past several months. So last legislative session, there was a resolution that created a continuous learning task force That was to create a set of recommendations for LDOE to implement for school systems to be better prepared than they were moving to modified operations from the pandemic. And so while that was the original intention of the resolution, the task force was to develop recommendations for any type of need for modified operations. So that could be for a single site that may have had a need to go to modified operations, maybe a fire, electricity's out, or a whole system or state. So that could be a weather emergency or a pandemic. So the task force created a set of recommendations in 4 areas: family engagement and support, instructional quality, system and school planning, and technology. Within those areas, they considered all types of emergencies that could occur and also just what the full scope of continuous learning could look like in those areas. And they created what the ideal state of that area would look like, the importance of that area, and then any recommendations around initiatives, guidance, or policy that could be created to support systems to be better prepared when an event like this happens again. So the full report would list all the recommendations, but some of them on the screen just to highlight the things that we'll be working on include digital literacy implementation with trainings for systems, schools, and families, providing school systems with emergency planning guidance with a framework for our early child care centers and K-12 systems so that they can include modified operations and continuous learning in those emergency plans. Also updating policy for school systems to create a policy that an emergency plan, including continuous learning, must be updated annually and reviewed. That is created by a group of stakeholders in that district. Also, best practices on how to use instructional minutes. So what could continuous learning look like virtually, or if virtual is not an option. So what are the different types of learning that can take place and what could that look like over the course of a day, week, month, or longer. And then also supports for parents, including a parent portal that would give them information about how to help their child at home, trainings or information related to using technology at home. And so there's a much larger list of recommendations, but I think that this task force did an excellent job of using working groups to review feedback that they received from not only internally LDOE that we received from school systems, but also surveys and things that were conducted to get input from everyone across the state. They also looked at different models that were used across the country during the pandemic and what was working and not working in other states to guide their recommendations in these areas. So what's happening now with this is the recommendations that the task force approved are now dispersed to our staff that lead work around these areas, and they will begin implementing these recommendations that will take place before next school year. So all of the recommendations you'll see will be released, whether that's guidance, supports for families, supports for school systems, prior to next school year.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. Dr. Brown, any additional comments? All right. Members, Dr. Bowden.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cooper. I have quite a few questions on it. So I hear you talking about guidance. Do you anticipate any policy changes?
The one policy change that the task force recommended is this one around ensuring that districts have a policy around this plan. So what we noticed was many systems did not have a plan to go to when the pandemic hit. And so in order to set systems up for success, if and when something causes them to go to modified operations, they did recommend a policy update that would require each system to create their own policy around emergency planning, and that plan should be reviewed and updated annually.
Okay. So I think that's a really good idea, and I think a good support for people is putting out like model policies. You know, because I think we have the staff here that could bring together different stakeholders and help develop model policies, because I know the capacity in districts varies. You know, I think about the districts I represent, and some would certainly have the personnel to do this, and then others wouldn't necessarily have the personnel. I think also that the other questions I have is that now that the world has changed, we know that there are going to be some students who have gotten really accustomed to virtual learning and are taking advantage of virtual learning opportunities. And so I would like for you to point to me where in the recommendations, or even if it's not specifically here, let me know what the conversation was about relative to attendance guidance, because that's a question, right? I think that was one of the biggest pieces early on, is that how do you know students are really engaging, and then what counts for attendance and what doesn't, I guess.
That was definitely a topic of discussion, and it is included in these recommendations. So what we found during this past year was we do have policy related to attendance as far as minutes goes, but I think to your point, it's how can those minutes be flexible in the sense of modified operations may require it to be, and so there is a recommendation to define what that could look like for systems. So what counts as attendance, what doesn't count as attendance, how can school systems make sure they're still providing the highest quality instruction, but it'll look and feel differently, not only in a virtual setting, but for cases where virtual may not be an option. So we had several schools and systems that had to do paper pencil packets and different things like that. So that is addressed here and will be part of the guidance that's released.
Okay. Then another one around, so the students who are going to stay, I do want to make a comment. So I am someone who would support moving to competency versus the instructional minute. Like, my belief is you can't ever get the minutes back, but you could achieve the learning, right? And so there are minutes that we're never getting back. But that doesn't mean kids can't achieve the learning, and they should be rewarded for that. So, but that's I think, much bigger philosophical conversation that will require tons of change. But I just want you to know where I stand on it. Okay, so the students who are, maybe like our middle schoolers, right? They are going to continue to stay in a virtual environment. What are our commitments to them? Are they just core 4? Are they in a virtual environment and we're also going to be providing PE? Like, what was the conversation around what the experience looks like and how we might achieve that experience?
Ms. Cooper, if I could jump in here real quick. I started on the committee as well, and appreciate Ms. Cooper's leadership. But maybe you might consider commenting. We had a lot of good discussion, I thought, about some sort of contract, if you will, for virtual learners, and what some of the things we considered in that contract might help us folks as well.
So I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but I think what might address some of it is part of the recommendations include what an ideal virtual learning program could look like for a school system. So if a student remains in virtual learning, or they have to move to modified operations because of virtual learning, especially for an extended period of time, what should quality look like in that aspect? And so that is addressed here. I'm not sure if that addresses your whole question though.
Well, I guess it's like a bigger question around what policies are going to count, right, in that environment, and then what's the accountability towards it? You know, because you have the students who are the receivers of the service, but then you have the educators who are being held accountable for the service. And I think that there's probably still a lot of work. I'm hearing from you, there's still quite a bit of work to be done in this area. Also, what were the conversations on student-teacher ratio?
I'm not sure if student-teacher ratio came up unless you remember differently, Ronnie. But I will say, you're right, this is really, the task force's work is done in the sense that they approve these recommendations, but the work to implement this is just starting. So all of these questions and comments will definitely help guide how the implementation works here, and our team will be working on that over the course of this year. So I definitely appreciate just the questions to be thinking about as
And
well.
I guess when you do this, I would probably chunk them, right? Because there's the kids who are gonna be virtual full-time, and what does the experience look like for them? There's the emergency situation that, it's gonna be some finite amount of time, and what does it look like for them? There might be other scenarios, but I do think what we're trying to provide is clarity, and as you move forward, you likely want to provide more information, because I think, we have our virtual charter schools who struggled with this, and they were incredible for me as we've been dealing with the pandemic, and I call on them and ask them questions, because they've been struggling with this, with some of these for years, and then they were like, oh yeah, now y'all really interested? I'm like, yes, I'm very interested. Like, what counts as attendance? How do you know? So I do think as much clarity as we can provide in that process would be important. I think the other one is around the teacher evaluation, right? So I know in the interim, we use the Compass rubric. I think I have questions about, is that the right way to go? Especially because an experience for someone who has students who are mostly asynchronous compared to more of a synchronous and asynchronous, or even like a hybrid model, is different. And so I think this goes back also to what Ms. Holloway was asking about with the learning pods, is that education is changing. What do we need to change relative to our policies and support that we're providing to, so that we're relevant and providing the support we need to?
Absolutely.
Other comments? Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you.
Appreciate your leadership on this one. Any objection to the motion? Hearing none, item passes. Next item, please.
The next item is on page 22, item 4.3, consideration of an update report regarding the Social Studies Standards Review Steering Committee. The department recommendation is to receive the report and the minutes of the meeting held September 25th, 2021.
Motion to receive. Mr. Garvey, second. Dr. Bovee, thank you.
Mr. Morris, just want to provide just a reminder to the board of where we stand in terms of the social studies review process. What has occurred since the last meeting of this board is that the steering committee voted, I believe by a vote of 19-1, to endorse a set of draft standards and requested that the department move those standards forward to BESE. What we have done as an agency is we have opened a public comment portal on our website so that members of the public can go in, they can look at each individual standard, they can offer feedback on each individual standard. We have promoted that portal, but we will continue to promote that portal to make sure that it is accessible and that people have notice of its availability, because we do value and appreciate the public's feedback. As I shared yesterday during a committee meeting of the House Education Committee, these are Louisiana standards for Louisiana children being developed by Louisianians, and so we definitely need the additional public comment from our members of our state. So the timeline at this point is public comment open through the month of October on the draft standards that have been endorsed by the steering committee. And then at this point, the timeline calls for the board to consider a set of standards at the December meeting of the board. So just wanted to take a moment and notify the board of where that process is right now. The work of the work group, which was 2 groups of teachers, I think 36 teachers in all, who built the standards, has been approved by the steering committee. That's now open for public comment, and then it ultimately, a set of standards would come to the board for consideration.
It will come to the board in December, is my understanding.
That is the present timeline.
Thank you, Dr. Burrow. Members, any comments? Mr. Garvey?
Yes, we have a copy of what's being proposed. It's kind of thick. If you try to compare this to the current standards, it would basically double in size what you need to look at. And if you were to try to compare what we currently have to this and maybe look at other suggestions, they triple in size. In summary, to say this is a lot of work. I've heard some people say that they have concerns that October might not be a long enough time frame to get their comments into our website. So I wanted to ask the superintendent, I believe that you have some flexibility in the time frame for which you would be bringing suggestions back to BESE. Does that flexibility include possibly bringing us stuff in January instead of December if this time frame does prove to be a problem?
Yes, sir. We've had a, in our mind, we've had a flexible time frame the entire period. If you recall, I pushed back the steering committee meeting a couple of months just because I felt like the amount of feedback that we received, or the amount of feedback the work group received necessitated pushing that back. And so we pushed that back. It's far more important to get the right set of standards as opposed to meeting just an arbitrary timeline. So, yeah, I mean, I don't take issue with that. And in fact, it might, depending on the amount of public feedback we received, it might be required.
And I would point out that the reverse might be true. If you don't get enough public feedback, it may be because the time frame is too short. So I ask you to keep that in mind. And if you feel like you need any more authority from BESE to keep your flexibility, let us know. We can adjust this right now if you would like.
Mr. Miller?
Thank you. Dr. Brumley, I know Mr. Morris and Mr. Castile and I were at the meeting yesterday. We talked a lot about that public portal. You and I have talked about public feedback and how important it is. I'm just curious, is there any formal policy or formal rule or anything within the department as to what's going to be done with that public feedback?
I mean, in terms of the feedback, we're super interested in what the feedback looks like because the department did not develop the standards. We facilitate the process, so we're really interested in that. But there's not anything formal in the process that requires us to utilize that feedback before making a recommendation to the board.
It sounds like it would take something from BESE to put the department to formally look at that public feedback and utilize it, just so we're clear and make sure that it is actually done, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we probably would be doing that anyway, but if it is the desire of the board, and I understand the point, it would formalize the request for us to utilize the feedback from the public and incorporate that into any recommendations we ultimately make to the board.
I'll let everybody comment. I'll make a substitute motion at the end to make sure we do that.
All right, thank you. Dr. Bolton?
Dr. Brumley, will you talk me through the steps that you're taking to advertise the feedback period, the public feedback period?
Yeah, so I mean, we have used the channels that we have available to us. So we've used the newsletter that goes out to all of our systems, and we'll continue to do that, which will be shared among professionals in those systems. We are posting to Facebook, we're posting to Twitter, or our social media avenues. We have shared the information with this board. We have shared the information with our members of the legislature so that they can also share with their constituents. But are open to any other ideas or suggestions that you might have moving forward. We actually even have it on the front page of our website at this point.
I've seen some of those and I really appreciate it. I think the struggle is, people are busy and get their attention and that kind of thing. I guess I would also just think about which groups might be especially interested in this. So to see, it sounds like you're using the mechanisms you have available, but I wonder about like the Association of Social Studies Teachers. I think it's Louisiana Council for Social Studies. And then community groups where that are particularly interested. I think it's great that we have the public comment period. I think the waste would be if people don't realize that the public comment period is there. And I think that it's gonna be on us and then on you and the department to continue to share and share again and communicate and, you know, I'm sure it'll feel like over communication to us, but just to get the word out, I think is really important. And I think that's what we all could be doing right now to ensure that we have a variety of people who are paying attention. So I think it's like even making the request of other groups to help us share it out. You know, sometimes it's that call to action to say, I think you could help me, or I need your help in this area. So, thank you.
Mr. Morris, I also wanted to say that once BESE approves, we have our own comment period, goes into the bulletin, and we still have another comment period. So if someone felt that the recommendations of the department weren't captured in their comments, they could always come to you and write in their comments again. And you could consider that as a board.
And so you're talking about through the notice of intent process, so they'll come to us, we'll approve them, then we go through the regular notice of intent process where those are publicized again, and people have the opportunity to write in.
Yes.
Okay.
If they write one comment's received, it automatically comes back to you. So if it's in January that you all approve and we advertise it immediately, then we'll get a comment and automatically comes back to you all to consider any written comment that you got during that notice process.
Yes, I guess my hope is that when we put it forward after that, to the notice of intent process, that we have, you know, really strong standards in place, and that, I think especially the way that this portal is probably more conducive to providing that comment, as Mr. Garvey said, is it can be a lot, but for people who are interested and passionate about it, like there's a portal set up that I think is probably makes it easier. But good point, we do. I mean, there are lots of ways that we engage people. Thank you.
The point was if someone didn't feel heard, you could follow up on that, like a checks and balances.
Thank you, Ms. Davis, for bringing that to our attention. Mr. Castillo.
Just to follow up, I'm happy to second Mr. Mellorin's motion if it hadn't been. In terms of the information that we received in the portal, just one clarification for me. One, that information, of course, will be reviewed by the department. Do you synthesize it in any way to provide it to us? How do we get an opportunity to review what you receive in as a department? I guess that's kind of the first thing. It's just a little clarification in terms of how do we get that information to review. And I'll also comment that, one, really appreciate the remarks of Dr. Chasson and Dr. Brumley yesterday before the committee. Did an excellent job with the presentation. And the engagement of the legislature in this particular committee and the public. It's always helpful for us in the process. So it was a good presentation yesterday, but Mr. Dr. Brumley could add a little more clarity with regards to the report. I appreciate it.
Yes, so the feedback that has been received to date has been feedback of individuals speaking at the steering committee, or, for instance, emails that have been provided or conversations with board and other constituents. The public portal for the first time will allow us to really capture that information, categorize it, look at patterns, synthesize that. So we will do that, and we will provide that information to the board as well.
Great, thank you. Ms. Oliver.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Brumley, I'd like to thank you and the Social Studies Committee, Dr. Chasson, for your hard work. But I need a couple of things to clarify. I know I expressed the concern with the inquiry process, or you called it the inquiry standards, which I know that is a teaching method. And since last meeting, I understand that it has been removed So the question is, where did it go, and can we find it some other place, and what did you put in its place? I'm assuming maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Holloway. It's a good question. For one, I would clarify that the standards are not the department standards. The standards are a set of standards developed by a work group that the department facilitated the process. So you're talking about the inquiry standards that were initially.
That is correct, that's
yeah.
right.
And that's where we had our discussion last time about, is that a teaching practice, Socratic method? What is that, and does it actually need to be a standard? And I remember that conversation last time. I thought that was a really good conversation. I think they've been moved to something called compelling questions. That might be the answer, but they are in many ways still in the document, not as inquiry standards, but they've been shifted to something I believe called compelling questions. And I may need Chanda to come up at this point, talk a little bit about where that shift was happening.
So am I understanding that the words are not inquiry standards, now they're compelling questions?
Hi, Chanda Johnson, Department of Education.
Maybe bump the mic.
There we go. Chanda Johnson, Department of Education. So what we did with what was called inquiry standards before, first we removed the part about action, civics, and that people were concerned about kind of at the end of that portion of the document. So if you review, you'll notice that that's been removed. When it came to the skills and practices, those really aren't about like teaching methods. They're really about how social studies is done. So, for example, a student is going to work with the document, and they're going to do something with it, and they're going to do social studies. So, to make it clear what that portion of the standards really is about, we renamed it skills and practices. So, just like in math, if you look at math standards, we have math practices. It's just kind of how you do math. We set up the social studies standards to make that more clear.
And as a point of clarity, the work group made that design.
Yes, sorry, I meant we like teachers, sorry, it's hard to.
So it's just getting clarity on what you were trying to do as developing social studies content standards and not ways of teaching or teaching methods. So I'm trying to get that.
Right, so it's not teaching methods, it's the things that students are gonna do as they're working with content. So, yes, they're gonna learn content, but to learn content, you do the content. Just like if I'm learning how to multiply, I don't just sit and watch people multiply. I have to model, I have to reason and
Teaching method, yeah, okay.
they're the math practices, right? So it's very similar. These are the social studies practices. It's the way that you do the social studies. The students have to be able to do something with what they're learning, and that's what the work group tried to make more clear in this newest version of the standard.
I have another question, but
Oh, no,
it's
go for
pertaining
it.
to this, yes? Okay. Thank you. I don't know if that really clarified my thinking about differentiating teaching methods versus standards, but thank you. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. That's it. No others for you. So Dr. Brumley, yesterday in the House Ed Committee, I know you were asked about if you endorsed the standards or you opposed the standards. How do you feel about the standards that have come before us?
Yeah, look, I think we had 36 teachers, I believe was the number, that brought to the table a ton of experience in the classroom, a ton of educational experience in terms of their degrees that developed those particular standards. I am not in a position at this point to go in and weigh in on my personal beliefs on those standards because I have not done the due diligence because that has not yet been my work. Are there some things that I look at and I think, well, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I have some concerns. Are there things I look at and say, okay, that makes sense? Yes to both of those. But I'm certainly not at a place where this draft set of standards is something I would bring to this board as a recommendation.
And the other question would have been to clarify comments out there. Until this date with your work group, steering committees, can you validate that this work group worked on those standards, modified the standards, and no one from the outside came in beyond to help?
The work group did the work, the department facilitated, and yes, I mean, we have received feedback from members of the public here in Louisiana who have weighed in at numerous times. I'm not aware of anyone outside of the state.
No, not outside,
Yeah.
in the state, that assisted or gave their opinion while these standards were being worked on, outside of the group, that weighed in.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think a number of people have weighed in over the course of time to give their feedback on the standards.
Thank you. Thanks for.
Thank you, Ms. Mullins. Mr. Castillo?
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Again, the hearing yesterday was very helpful for me as a BESE member to hear. One of the comments that came up from the audience was a parent. There was a number of parents and a few educators there, and an emphasis on how it's important with social studies and the standards that we don't lose the emphasis on the content, that students truly are learning information at its basic level, and then build upon that. So I like the conversation of the evolution of the pedagogy, that we start off with kids need to know the facts, and then build from there. And there becomes this higher level of thinking and learning, and that there are different ways that educators may be able to probe that to ensure that students not only have an understanding of the basic facts, but this higher level of thinking as it relates to, it may be inquiry method, it may be other ways in which educators might probe students to learn more, particularly in the middle school and in the high school grades, where we've got some incredibly bright students that are going to be leading not only the state, but the world. And I look at the young man this morning that's in 6th grade. And if he's in 6th grade, I suspect 11 years old, I can only imagine what he will be capable of ascertaining and grasping, and then challenging all of us throughout his life. And so I really don't want us to put limits on the abilities of our children. We want to make sure they really master that content. But yesterday was a great example of American democracy, where you had people from the public that came up and spoke to the House Education Committee and expressed themselves in a manner that I thought was instructive. But we certainly want to ensure that our children have the skill set to be able to do that as they become adults. And I don't want to speak for Mr. Morris and Mr. Mullins, but it was helpful to hear that sort of public engagement and comment. And then as a result of all of that public engagement and comment, I'm always reminded of how much common ground there is, and that sometimes we think very differently about issues and topics, particularly around social studies. But when you drill down, at the end of the day, so many of us simply want the very same thing for our children and for our community. So I appreciate the process that's in place, both with BESE and the legislature and the engagement from the community. And I know we have more to do, but I'm very heartened by where we are and the progress that we're making.
Thank you, Mr. Castillo, for those encouraging words.
You're welcome, Mr. Morris.
Other members, comments before we get back to Mr. Miller and his substitute motion?
Just one point, Mr. Mullins. I want to clarify just that there can't be this opinion that we're where we need to be with social studies. When we look at, and I shared this with the House Ed Committee yesterday, when you look at our proficiency rates or mastery rates, when we talk about English and math, they're in the 40s. and our proficiency rates in social studies, our students mastering social studies is like 25%. It's the lowest content area we have. And is a set of standards the only way to improve understanding of content? No, but I think it's certainly a contributing and important factor to boosting student outcomes. So the work that we are doing is certainly important, and we definitely need to see greater outcomes with our kids in social studies.
All right, let's move back to Mr. Mellon. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, do you have a comment?
I do, if that's okay.
Yes, sir.
Well, I actually have a question.
Also, I think I like the on-off button. I think that's a great addition. I just have a question pertaining specifically to a course that I'm taking this year, and I'm not sure exactly who I should direct this towards, but I like to preface it by saying I really appreciate all the time and effort that's been put into the new revisions and standards for social studies. I come from a household with a former social studies teacher. My dad actually taught 7th and 8th grade social studies for a long time, and I really appreciate it. But how might these new standards impact, and again, I'm not sure who this question's for, how might they impact a high school student's ability, and for that matter, eligibility, to take dual enrollment and AP social studies courses for high school credit? For example, I'm taking AP psychology this year, but it also counts for my high school social studies credit this year. I'm not taking a history as well. So in the future, would that class continue to be a high school credit course or just an AP course? And how does that fit in? I guess Dr. Brumley.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and this is why we have you up on that dais. So when we're talking about dual enrollment, that is a coordinated effort between the school system and the college and university. And so they develop that syllabus, and that is essentially how that works. So there's some level of flexibility there between what that university knows that Louisiana is expecting from its students and what they're offering. And that's a clear partnership. When we're talking about AP, that's a little different because AP essentially sets their own content outside of necessarily the state of Louisiana. So it works in a couple of different ways, but what we can do after today is we can take some time and we'll set you up with the Career and College Readiness Department and they can dive into that a little deeper with us.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Ms. O'Shea.
Dr. Brumley, I'm going to piggyback on John's question. AP psychology, counts for satisfying the social studies requirements. Dual enrollment psychology, Bradford's looking at, because I've had this discussion with you before, we don't have, and if I get this a little bit wrong, Mr. Bradford, correct, there are college-level psychology classes, but we do not have standards, psychology standards for high school course. So our kids currently cannot take dual enrollment psychology, even if they're enrolled in a college course, they can't get the high school credit for it. When we adopt these new standards, will we be able to fix that situation where we will have some psychology standards that we can align with the college as well so that the students have the availability of taking it as a dual enrollment?
I'm going to say something you already know, but not every course code that we have established set of standards for the state of Louisiana. It's much more expansive than just psychology. I think that the high school standards for social studies are really around civics and U.S. history. I don't think that they go into the particular around psychology, so I think that would be a different conversation if we were going to develop some form of psychology standard.
Well, I would like us to see to actually do that because it really inhibits our students' ability to take that as a dual enrollment credit. AP psychology is fine. It's the dual enrollment that is not being
Okay. Other comments, members? Mr. Bellerin, I think you had want to have some discussion on the substitute motion.
Yeah, so in hearing some of the other concerns and points raised by the members, restate it, tweak it a little bit. but it'd be a substitute motion, and it would be a motion for the department to receive the report, and then also to direct the department to utilize public feedback in drafting the standards, and to extend the time period for which the portal is going to be open, and move it from the end of October until the end of November. And then, as a result of that pushback, then the department's going to come forward with the proposed standards from December to the January meeting.
Mr. Garland. Second. Any opposed? So, Dr. Davis?
I just want to be clear when, about what the definition of utilize is. So you're asking the department to listen and to consider the public comments, or are you directing the department to change the standards in light of public comment?
To consider, just to, Dr. Brumley, I believe, said there was no formal policy directing the department or requiring the department to consider it. And just so we're clear, the department, we're asking them to make sure they do listen to the public comment. Not saying that they're going to change anything or required to change anything, but just to consider it as a factor as part of that public feedback.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Any further discussion? Is there any opposition? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item.
The next item is on page 24, item 5.2, consideration of revisions to Bulletin 111, the Louisiana School District and State Accountability System regarding school letter grade transition scale. The department recommendation is to approve the notice of intent.
Motion to approve. Mr. Garvey, second. Ms. O'Shea, thank you. Superintendent Brown.
Yes, sir. The language included in your packet is basically what we captured from the last meeting of the board, the request from the board to the department. And what we are in turn proposing is a delay in when that next set of cut scores for the jump in letter grades would hit. We would still end in 25 year with 100 being the A, but there is a delay in which that we are proposing the timeline to get there. So the end result does not change. 100 is an A by 24-25 school year. We just eliminate the immediate jump in this transition as a result of the number of impacts from the pandemic to hurricanes, etc.
Thank you for that clarification. Members, any comments? Sullivan?
Yes, Dr. Rowley, I need to question the title of the item. So if you can take note, the title is school letter grade, transition. However, in the backup doc, it's called letter grade delay. Can we take a look at that? Because I'd like to make a motion to make certain that the language is the same. A motion that the backup doc with the proposed changes should have a title that is aligned to the item that's on the agenda, school letter grade transition scale. Can you make note of that? I don't know who would make that correction, just to make certain that it aligns. I know it's said in the backup doc.
Okay.
So just take note with the department if they can make certain that we pay more attention about that language, that we don't want any of our board members to be confused about the action taken.
Where can you see letter grade delay? I'm sorry.
In the board doc, I don't have it out, but I know it was in the board.
Just checking here.
Board doc, check to see. Yeah, where it says, letter grade delay, let's see if I'm reading it right. And we're amending it to baseline transition grading scale, which I, definitely supporting it. It's just, it's the language, so we can take it.
Ms. Davis, you can help us out with that after the meeting and follow up.
Yeah.
Let's take your letter grade.
Thank you.
Otherwise, it's good.
Thank you, Ms. Holloway. Members, any other comment? Mr. Mallon? Any other comment on the substitute motion? Any opposition? Hearing none, motion carries.
The next item is on page 26, item 5.3, consideration of a waiver of policy contained in Bulletin 111, Louisiana School District and State Accountability System, and Bulletin 133, scholarship programs for the 2020-2021 school year, submitted by the State Superintendent of Education. The updated department recommendation is, oh wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Overtime.
Apologies, Mr. Fall.
That's okay. I know you're trying to get through the agenda, but no, Michael Falk with the Louisiana Association of School Superintendents to talk about item 5.2. We have changed the target for letter grades. We first set target in 2014, changed the target to 2025. This does not do anything to change the target. We're still going to have the 100 and the 95. Even with a delay, you only have 1 year at 90 and 1 year at 95. If you look at the statistics, you see that the breakdown is the percentages of students, the percentages of schools falling in the lower levels increases, while the percentage of students in the higher levels decreases. You're still going to have that same drop and increase. So the year that you're putting in there is not going to make any difference in the end result. I just think you need to understand that. I think people need to understand that districts are already trying to calculate where they are. They're trying to determine how much they've lost in this upheaval that we've had. But I just want everybody to understand that the increase in the bottom, the decrease at the top is still going to occur if you look at the past history and the trends.
Thank you, sir.
The next item is on page 26, item 5.3, consideration of a waiver of policy contained in Bulletin 111 and Bulletin 133 for the 2020-2021 school year, submitted by the State Superintendent of Education. There's an updated department recommendation to receive.
Motion to receive. Saul Lynn, second. Mr. Garvey. Superintendent Brown.
Yes, sir. We, at the last board meeting, the board authorized the department to make requests to the federal government around waiver of some of the ESSA requirements. Beyond that action of the board, we opened that up for public comment. We sought public comment, we captured public comment, and then we forwarded that request to the U.S. Department of Education along with the public comment that we received. We anticipated the possibility that we would have received notice on the waiver by this particular meeting, however we have not as of yet. But what we feel like is important is for us to at least provide a recommendation to you on what could happen in terms of letter grades that we feel takes into account a number of different perspectives, sometimes on very opposite ends of the spectrum on how to handle this particular issue. So our recommendation would be that we carry over the 18-19 letter grades as they exist now. When you go to School Finder, that would be the SBS, DPS, and letter grade that you see as the official letter grade SBS, DPS for a school and a school system. Beyond that, we would create a separate COVID dashboard, essentially, where you can go in. On that particular dashboard, we would have all of the information available that we have to us, from attendance rates to mastery rates, raw data from the COVID year, academically and otherwise. And we would also do our best to calculate a simulated SPS to include on that particular dashboard. And that simulated SPS should not be used, in our opinion, for evaluative purposes because it's not an apples-to-apples comparison to previous years. We're having to, for the first time, consider the use of a growth skip year methodology for calculating growth, which we had previously not done. We have to consider the class of 2020 and the waivers for those seniors to be able to graduate. We have to consider the fact that we had additional waivers for EOC testing last year. We were running at our highest point only about 75% of our schools in daily face-to-face instruction last year. Schools were impacted by a number of different COVID-related issues, and so it's just not an apples-to-apples comparison to previous years. But at the same time, we recognize that, number one, the public wants to know the status of their schools, and certainly in terms of the raw data, they want that information as well. So what we would propose is the calculation of the skip year, not the skip year, the simulated SPS. And as an example, it would look something like if the SPS was calculated, the simulated SPS, it was an 85.0, we might do like a C 85.0, which would be COVID 85.0. So there would be transparency in having the number to our best ability to calculate that, but at the same time recognizing that it should not be used for evaluative form in any way, and it's not an apple-to-apple comparison to previous years.
Members' comments? Dr. Bowman?
So what's the status? What's the status on the waiver?
We completed the waiver request, we accepted the public feedback, we submitted all of that to the Department of Education, federal, U.S. Department of Education, and we are awaiting their response at this period point.
Okay, so it was in our packet as a approve direct, and I heard a motion to receive instead. Can you talk me through?
Yeah. So we went ahead and initially put this on the agenda because the board docs go live
Like
2
10
weeks
days
out.
early or
Yeah.
something.
And so we went ahead and put it in there under the assumption that we would have received the federal waiver. But at this point, since we haven't received that, we just moved it to a received report. So the board would have to take it up again at a later date, or the board, there are other options that the board might be able to consider to go ahead and move this forward if they choose.
But the bottom line is, any action that the board would approve wouldn't go into effect until after we receive the federal approval. Is that correct?
That's right.
But we could do that, I mean, we could do that.
My understanding is that we could today go ahead and implement the policy that would take effect once we got the federal approval.
Right, we don't have the approval, we could consider the item today. You even have opportunities where even the board president potentially could be authorized to sign off. It would come back to be ratified. There are a number of different options that could be considered.
Okay, all right. Who made the motion to receive? I guess if I just would like a little more background on like where we are right now.
Yeah, can you repeat that, Dr. Bowman? I'm getting too conversation.
No, that's okay. I just, so the department changed their recommendation to receive. Is that right?
That's right.
And it's based on the fact that the waiver wasn't approved
right,
yet?
yes.
Okay. Have you had any interactions with the U.S. Department of Ed as to what their timeline might be?
Yes, we have, and we fully expect, just based on what we've seen from other states, that the waiver would be approved. Of course, we can't say it's going to be, we're not them. But looking at what they have previously processed, it appears to us that ours is very much in line with the other states across the country who've already submitted and have been approved.
Do we know what the timeline has been for them approving other states?
No, but They are hesitant to give us a particular timeline, as other states that also still have, I believe, their application in, but they did share with us that they are moving as quickly as they possibly can. I wish I had more information on that, but I do not.
Other comments? Ms. Holloway?
Are you on recommendation 1 or 2? Because 1, we
The
don't have
motion
to
on the floor is to receive. The recommendations in backup were amended to be all be received at this time. But y'all are having a conversation about potentially moving forward.
So recommendation 1, we don't have the federal waiver. Okay, so we move forward to, can I talk about recommendation 2?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have some questions here about the recommendations, and I need clarity on what exactly is a simulated school letter grade? And does the statute that mandates letter grades allow for it? So, and I have other questions about what state requires, what fed requires versus state, and it's different. And so there's some language here that I think is confusing to the public, and even when I'm reading it. So you want me to restate the first question?
Yeah, what was the
Well, the question is, what exactly is the simulation of letter grade distribution? Your recommendation, simulated school district performance scores.
So a simulation would be, in previous years, there was a level of confidence based on the ability to accurately calculate an SPS and it be relevant and consistent across multiple years. Given a number of reasons, we do not believe that we can say that a particular SPS that we would calculate would be in line with previous years because of a number of reasons. One of those being we've never had to do what's called a skip year methodology to calculate growth. And so we're actually having to calculate growth across 2 years, making some assumptions on where a child would have been in the middle of that process because they did not test. So we're having to use something called skip year methodology, which we've talked through multiple times in Accountability Commission, Superintendent's Advisory Council, and then here of how we would do that. The other factors that I think that come into play that are important are some of the waivers around high school graduates that were made available to systems that aren't the same, that did not previously happen, as well as some of the waivers around EOCs and credentials that previously did not happen. So our data sets are not the same from previous years as they are in this particular year. So when we're saying simulated, we're just saying that the SPS to the best of our ability to calculate that, but at the same time saying it cannot be an apple-to-apple comparison to previous years.
Understood. Parts of that. Why would we be releasing data before February 1st? I have, through my years of experience, haven't had such a late date of February 1st. We're accustomed to by November, and previous administration would deliver it even October, so we can pre-plan for delivery of instruction, intervening, just different avenues to support children. Let's put February 1st.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are just additional considerations in order to process it this year, to make sure that we're getting this done in an accurate way. Again, even on skip year methodology, this is something we've never done before. It allows us some level of additional time to work through the processing of the schools.
Well, I would disagree, and I would oppose this February 1st because as an administrator in a school or district level, working with data is very important for us to move forward within a school year to reach the capacity of kids and learning outcomes. And I have a very hard time with districts receiving this information in February, whereas towards the end of the school year. I would recommend that by December 1st, that and then we're pushing that these districts need data.
Now, I appreciate that on the SPS, but I would share that they already do have their raw data that they're probably making their instructional decisions from, which would be their mastery rates and unsatisfactory rates.
Yeah, so that would be a question, why not? Why not December 1st?
Well,
Districts.
again, it's just giving us additional time to make some calculations that, you know, we talked about things that the department has previously done. The department has previously never had to complete a skip year methodology, so we're just allowing ourselves some additional time for that. But certainly welcome, you know, any additional feedback or direction.
Well, I would disagree, and I would hope that we could move forward with December 1st.
Dr. Brumley, may I add? There's two additional items that I would just put on the table. Test results came back about a month later.
Excuse me, Thomas, for the record, could you identify yourself?
Thomas Lambert, Assistant Superintendent, Assessment, Accountability, Analytics. That is a mouthful. I think that's the first time I've said that to a microphone. So there's two additional things to remember. One, assessment results came back about a month later, which means data certification began significantly later. And then the second piece is the significant impact of Hurricane Ida. And we do have some districts that are just now getting to complete their data certification process, which is critical to making sure that all of the different measures are accurate. So I think that we could do it by the end of the calendar year, but I think that December 1st might push us a little bit, and we would do our best to deliver as quickly as we can possibly get it to you.
Well, I would want a stated deadline of December 1st today, and not wait of whether you can or not, to be able to help districts. I just need some help with.
Districts do have all of the pre-certification data that they can calculate that, but we do hear and understand what you're saying.
Let's come back to that, Ms. Holloway, let's not lose sight of that. Dr. Bowlby?
Well, I think, like Ms. Holloway, I feel a sense of urgency around this issue in particular. I know people wanted to talk about letter grades like a year ago, and I kept putting that conversation off and asked people to focus on have students take the test. Let's take the test, let's figure out where we stand. And so it's frustrating that we haven't heard back from USN any longer. I wonder, I mean, I would prefer for us to move with the recommendations as you had set forth originally, Dr. Brumley, contingent upon approval of our waiver, so that there's no more holdup. I'm assuming that impacts your staff as well, is that if you know what you're doing and you know what you're working towards, then you can move a little faster. And I think I'm hearing Ms. Holloway's concern about the February 1st date, and I just wonder if we couldn't, instead of making that February 1st as soon as possible, to get this information out to districts while also managing, just making sure that everything gets certified, because, you know, what worse is it being late is if it's wrong. And so, if I could get a support for that, I would move that we approve recommendation 1, that recommendation 2, we approve removing the date and instead inserting as soon as possible. And then direct the department to take all these actions contingent upon the approval of our waiver.
But as soon as possible could be January 30th. So,
I hear that it could be as early as December 30th, and I think if the two of y'all get together, you can even make it sooner than that. So.
November 30th.
I think we could potentially deliver by December 1st, but I want to just be, we're going to be very aggressive on that timeline and making sure that we have it, but I also don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, was my concern there, particularly since it was a board directive.
Mr. Lambert, you might be getting in the way of me getting a second, so just a second, sir. Thank you, Mr. Mellon. I got a second.
Thank you, Mr. Melvin.
Is this a continued conversation about letter grades, school performance score, hold harmless? Is this the area item to discuss? I don't think we have clarity on what are our plans as a board.
Go ahead, Dr. Roman.
Yes, so this is the discussion around how to handle SPS for the 2021 school year. Was there something else?
Well, I just need clarity on whether, are we talking about hold harmless where schools will receive a letter grade? They can't go down, but if we go up, they're hold harmless, no consequence. Can somebody talk about this? Because I don't want to move forward and it hasn't been a discussion.
So the official, under the recommendation, the official letter grade of the school would be their 18-19 letter grade, which is on the school finder.
But can schools go up where we know that there are some districts that have gone up?
I don't know that there are districts that have gone up. We haven't gone through that process yet. You're wanting to know if we do a simulated SPS and the district goes up, would that then be their official letter grade?
If we do hold harmless, no? So everybody's going to get the same letter grade.
And then you have it simulated for what you would have gotten if we counted these scores.
Yeah, we've talked about hold harmless before, and I'm still not exactly certain what hold harmless means.
No consequences.
So what would the consequence be?
None. I mean, they would not be held against that.
So I think that you used the word not evaluative earlier, and I think what I'm hearing from Ms. Holloway as hold harmless and what I'm hearing from you as not evaluative, in my mind are the same things.
Yeah, I mean, I think on our, whenever we post the data, we're going to indicate that, this should not be used in evaluative form in any way based on the school, the leaders, the educators, because it is simply a simulation.
So connected to this notion of people who, in a very difficult time, may have risen, is there a tweak that we could make so that if someone's school performance score did go up under this scenario, would you guys, is that something that you could feel confident enough that we could publish as their school performance score? I mean, this is very intriguing, especially if we had a list of what those schools are, given the circumstances that we've been under.
Right. Mr. Leonard, I don't know what was included to that extent in the actual ESSA submission.
Given the fact that the school finder is the official department report card for ESSA purposes, I don't believe the federal government would approve that. But there wouldn't be anything that would stop the school district or the school from using that score and celebrating that score and sharing that score.
I think what may be confusing is the federal government versus the state, where federal government expects school performance scores, not letter grade. State does, so someone needs to explain the difference about how do we move forward knowing what the state mandate is, the law of the grade, and does BESE have the right not to post a grade or post a grade? Anybody in legal, Dr. Leger, explain that?
Yeah, so let's get clarification for where we're at. So what I understand is that Ms. Holloway requested a legal interpretation for the differentiation between the federal waiver and how it would be handled locally. So I'm not sure if this fund is available.
Yeah,
Or Dr. Leger and Carlson?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would need this time for legal around a legal question, but we do have an act of the legislature from last year around this particular issue, which was the Chuck Owen legislation that does provide some level of direction in terms of the state legislature on their requests in terms of letter grade.
I think we're looking for maybe a little more formal interpretation, Ms. Holloway's request to differentiate our understanding of the federal waiver versus how it would be handled in the state with regard to how the SPS would be handled.
Or letter grade. Dr. Leger, you're in policy.
I think we would need, if you're asking a legal question, we would need to pull up Joan, who's not available at the present time, but we can make her available for that question at a later date. So if we need
Later date, okay. So are you saying that you're not quite sure what the state mandate is in regards to the letter grade versus federal?
I think what we have done is in alignment with what we have seen from from the state. And so that is, consistent with us providing a request to the U.S. Department of Education to waive.
Waive school performance scores, data, but not the letter grade.
That is all inclusive in that particular waiver request. We have a, in your handout, there's a listing of the things that were requested for waiver from the federal government. Mr. Lambert, you may want to come up and work through the different items that have been requested to be waived.
I think the first thing that I would say before I do that is we can certainly look and work over the next month or so to figure out exactly what would be possible and what would be permissible under the waiver and what the specifics of those requirements are around whether we could show a higher letter grade of the two in particular locations on the school finder. So we could certainly study that, and nothing within what you would be doing today would stop us from doing that. It would be permissible under the law. So we can do that for sure. I'm also happy to walk through each of these waivers of policy if it is helpful, and talk through each of them if that is helpful to you and desired. Yes?
I don't want to take that much of the time. Okay. I didn't get the answer.
Other comments? Dr. Davis?
I have a question regarding the calculations of the scholarship cohort index for the student scholarship program. So under the current recommendations, are schools that were prohibited from accepting scholarship students because of their 1920 score, are they still then prohibited from accepting new scholarship students because there has been no uptick in their score? So even if they have managed to improve, we're not going to be calculating that. I just want to make sure I understand that that's what we're doing.
That's correct, but we still will calculate that and simulate that data as well, just like with the other components. So that data will be available, but it will not change for any accountability or evaluative purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Other member comments before we go to public comment? Ms. O'Shea?
Okay, I'm just trying to understand what we're proposing to do. I think the state superintendent has already said that these scores in relation to our prior scores are apples and oranges. You cannot relate the two because of many different factors. The growth of the skip year, we all know with the virtual learning and such that the scores of those students were at least 15 percentage points lower. We had many students not even taking the test, all those zeros would be added in. So it would be a very difficult comparison. So my question is, explain to me exactly, or I'm going to tell you what I thought I heard, and please correct me if I'm incorrect with what I heard, okay? That you're proposing to calculate a school performance score, put a C in front of it for a COVID year. But that it has, in our Louisiana school finder, leave the 1819 score and letter grade. And that these COVID scores would not carry any negative consequences. In other words, no schools would go into CIR or UIR. The newly eligible for vouchers, no other consequence of the score would arise, since it is not, we're saying really publicly that it's not necessarily a valid score, or let's say a score that you can compare to the prior year. If that's the case, and is there any then validity instead of actually, what if the purpose is to give schools and communities information on how schools are doing and how schools are doing and students are doing, just if we've got all the data on the kids, we've already made their plans, we've already done their instructional plans, they've scored below mastery, we have them in all the tutoring programs and such, we've done the IAIPs that we need to do for those students, and we're progressing along. to put maybe almost make it like a dashboard in terms of which index would be for each assessment, like assessment index, maybe calculate growth index, and calculate the different components if you so choose. Instead of running it up into a score that we don't even think is comparable to a prior year. If the purpose is really to give the schools and the students and the parents and the community information, we've got a wealth of information we've already put out. But if we want to roll it up into an index, that's fine, roll it up into an index this year. Or are we just saying we're gonna roll it up into a school? What about the DPS? Are you gonna put us, calculate that as part of this and put us in part of that as well?
The recommendation is to simulate all of the data that is waived in the policy. We will continue to generate that data for the purposes of simulating and knowing exactly where everything stands. So
And
everything
that's
is
what your term simulated means in its recommendation, that you would just roll up a score and you're just calling it a simulated score.
we would also calculate the sub-indices as well.
What?
The sub-indices, the assessment index, the achievement index, the progress index, we would do each of those sub-indices as well.
Would you then run scores for all subgroups as well?
We would calculate under the proposal every data point that has been calculated in the past. We would calculate for this year with a simulated indicator.
So you're proposing to just run up all the scores, put a C in front of it, and not put any negative consequences on it. Is that it?
Yes.
And if what Ms. Holloway was asking, that we would, if the school would benefit from it and potentially or possibly allow them to get a higher.
We can explore that with US Ed. We're not certain that that would be allowable, but we're happy to explore that beyond that.
And we're doing that because we feel that it does what? What is the benefit of running a score, simulated score, putting a C in front of it and making an official statement that's not complicated to do with prior years and other reasons? What do we accomplish? And what is the impact?
Well, we would, to all extents possible, we would be sharing the information that we have in a way that is as close to possible as previous years, but also with the caveat that it should not be used in an exact comparison to previous years because of all the obvious reasons.
Members, any other comments before we go to public comments? Mr. Castillo?
I want to follow up on Ms. Boucher's questions in terms of how we use this data. The schools already have the information that they need to inform instruction. Is that right, Mr. Lambert?
That's correct.
So if we move forward with the recommendations, how might schools further use this simulated data to inform instruction, particularly given the release when we actually publish this new data?
I'm not.
I said new data. I'm not really sure it's new data. It's just the simulation of the data that everyone already has. Correct?
That's correct. I don't know that school performance scores necessarily in their total, right, are used to determine instructional practice on a daily basis by a teacher. I think that it is used by districts to make determinations around needs at particular schools, those types of things. I think that the simulated data also provides an opportunity for districts to kind of set a, where were we during COVID and where do we expect to be next year? Which factors do we think were caused by A or B related issues that students may have faced? Which ones are going to be mitigated fastest and which ones we think will be persistent? And then that can be used to set new goals and understanding what they might see their scores look like next fall. So we do think that the transparency of the data, the sharing of the data, is something that we've heard from a lot of folks as we've talked about this So we felt it was important to simulate it. We know that at some point districts will ask us to simulate it for them, give us something that we can use that uses the metrics and the business rules that you all follow. So we decided that it would probably be in the best interest to share that information much more publicly and make sure that folks have that, because ultimately people will ask us for it.
So Dr. Bofi should toss you a quarter, because if she hadn't gotten a second before, she certainly would get one now in response. And at some point, if there are no other questions, Mr. Chair, I'd like to call the question. I think there is one.
All right, I'm sorry, you're ready to go to public comment, is that what I'm saying? Okay, great. Thank you. So I'd call Dr. Janet Poe forward. She wishes to speak. Dr. Poe. Okay, Mr. Paul follows Dr. Poe. Followed by Ms. Posey and Mr. Ford. Dr. Poe.
Thank you. Jana Pope, Louisiana School Board Association. The board and the department were sent a copy of a letter from the Louisiana School Board Association outlining our position on agenda item 5.3 concerning the issuance of state and district performance scores and letter grades. The details of our position are included in the letter, so I'll provide a brief summary for public comment. The LSBA supports recommendation number 1 and urges BESE to waive several provisions of state policy to align in with the context of the federal waiver this board directed the department to seek. In the absence of approving recommendation 1, the state would choose to hold schools and districts accountable for data that was influenced by a variety of external sources. Our communities deserve to have accurate information about the performance of their local schools. Issuing letter grades based on unreliable data would only serve to provide our communities with incomplete and potentially inaccurate descriptions of the local schools. Moreover, in the midst of unprecedented series of events that has led to unfinished learning, disruptions in educational minutes, to include not only the pandemic, but hurricanes and tornadoes across our state, and new untested methods, it would be inappropriate to tie those consequences and finances to unreliable data. We urge your support in recommendation number 1. In regards to recommendation 2, we urge BESE to reject the recommendation. The LDOE is asking BESE to move forward with the calculation of quote-unquote simulated letter grades. Not only do simulated letter grades have no universal definition, but the calculation of such a score would also hinder, not help, the recovery efforts of our school systems. There is little debate that student outcomes were influenced. The lack of reliability in the data results and the lack of confidence that the data is useful in the aggregate. What purpose will this serve? How will they be distinguished from traditional letter grades? How do we manage the unintended consequences of simulated letter grades, quote unquote? Who will correct and incorrect assessments of student and district performance? Who will stop the comparisons of simulated letter grades to previous or subsequent accountability years? And who will overcome the misinterpretations of these sources as being traditional? Our schools are focused on the important work of recovery from what has been an extraordinary set of circumstances and events. Their focus, our focus, everyone's focus, should be moving our students forward, period. We urge you to reject recommendation number 2 and keep the focus on reliable recovery efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Falk, and on deck is Ms. Cynthia Taylor.
Michael Falk with the Louisiana Association of School Superintendents. Let's call it like it is. You can have a simulated score. You can have a simulated number. People are going to take that simulation and assign a letter grade to it. You don't have to assign a letter grade to it. People are going to assign letter grades to it. Think of the consequences we're looking at. The contracts with principals, performance objectives. Contracts with supervisors, performance objectives. Contract with superintendents, performance objectives. There are a lot more things involved in this. We all know that we've been through an unusual set of circumstances. You are not comparing apples to apples. The last reliable data you have to determine a school performance score and a district performance score is 2018-19 school year. The next comparison should be with reliable data so you can compare apples to apples. Districts are working extremely hard to make up learning loss. They're working extremely hard to help their teachers. They have worked extremely hard to offer varying opportunities for students. Let's not forget the hard work that is going on right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Falk.
Mr. Chair, can I ask questions of the,
Yes, sir. Mr. Falk, you have a second?
Mr. Falk?
Mr. Falk?
Mr. Falk?
Sorry. Mr. Castillo?
I just wanted to follow up on your comments. I heard the superintendent say, and then Ms. Holloway referenced the fact that if we issued these simulated SPS scores, that everyone would be held harmless, or would not be used for evaluative purposes. But I just heard you testify that you believe that actually will be, that performance contracts, and that folks will actually use whatever we generate in terms of simulated SPS scores for evaluative purposes. Can you expound on that? I know you mentioned superintendents and others. I just want to make sure I'm clear how might this data be used.
When you outline performance objectives in the contract, you set goals of achievement that you expect that person to perform. And with the principals, if they've had issues with the performance of their school, and you place in a contract a performance objective of a minimum amount of growth, then the issue becomes, have they met that performance objective? And I don't know, in each individual situation, it depends on how the authority who evaluates that person determines whether or not that should be used in renewing the contract. And you have to do it 120 days before the end of the contract.
So I have two thoughts about that. There might be some that are saying, well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that we want to evaluate the performance in some way, and now we have some sort of benchmark in place. Others might say, which I think is your point, well, that's really unfair because we're in the middle of COVID. So to use that as a tool would be unfair at these times. Just out of curiosity, if the purpose is for this to be non-evaluative, Mr. Superintendent, Dr. Brumley, is there any way to guard against what Mr. Falk just referenced, and that school districts and others may use this for evaluative purposes, notwithstanding our admonition?
Well, for us, whether it's my word, which is not evaluative, or Ms. Holloway's word, which is hold harmless, I mean, the language is going to be for us on the dashboard that says it should not be used in evaluative form. So, I mean, if a school board, for instance, wanted to use that in some particular way, I mean, they would be very clearly going against the actual information that's available to them about the SPSB simulation.
Absolutely. There are no consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Falk.
Mr. Castillo?
I was just going to say thank you, Mr. Falk. That's very instructive. One more thing is that we would not be issuing letter grades. It's just a simulated SPS score. I know Mr. Falk said that people will do it. I I get that. I just wanted to clarify for the public because I think, and Ms. Polk, was it you that said that you were referencing the actual letter grades, it's only the SBS score that would be simulated, correct? Mr. Superintendent?
Repeat that one more time for me.
We're not issuing simulated letter grades, only the SBS.
Right, so we would draft or we would create a simulated SBS, and we would put essentially a C in front of it for COVID, give the SBS number, that would go on the dashboard with all the other information.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Holloway? I'm sorry.
Okay, I want to clarify something, and that's.
Ms. Holloway, do
Teresa, can I?
you have a question for Mr. Falk? Can we let him go, or do you have something for the board?
Thank you, Mr. No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Just for
Falk.
clarity, the question I asked earlier, ESSA versus a Fed versus state. Let me share just a couple of statements here. ESSA does not require school letter grades. That's Fed. It requires a method to report school performance. Some states do dashboards, some use other information, some other ways, and Louisiana uses letter grades. If the feds waive this, it is for ESSA reporting. However, here's the catch. There is still the state law requiring the grades. So that's where we are.
I think we would handle, I think that would be handled in the same way it was handled last year, in that you have the pullover of the previous grade. And so the actual official letter grade for the school would be the one that has been pulled over and is on the report card.
That's right, it goes over.
Right.
You can't go down, you can only go up. So, Jen?
Is that second part correct, that you can't go up? Is that it, sir?
No, I mean, we would pull over the 18, 19. We would leave what's on School Finder right now. It would stay there, which is the 18, 19 information, which is the last year where we have confidence in the score and the letter grade. And officially, that is the official SBS and letter grade of the school.
I just want us to be clear what would happen with the passage of the recommendations, that the actual letter, official letter graded SBS score stays the same. We only have the simulation for purposes of all of the instructional discussions that we're having now. Okay, thank you.
Hold harmless, no consequences.
Okay, I'm going to move on to next public comment card. Is Ms. Posey voting? Mr. Ford's on deck.
Cynthia Posey with the Louisiana Federation of Teachers. Cynthia Posey with the Louisiana Federation of Teachers. On behalf of LFT, I'm here in support of the other stakeholders that came earlier. But I would be remiss if I did not point out that none of the waivers considered today will help to staunch the bleed of qualified educators leaving the profession or increase the negligible drip of people who want to enter the profession. In 2021, in the legislative session, LFT and other stakeholders submitted 4 instruments, 2 bills and 2 resolutions to request and address waivers for SLTs in the accountability system for 2021. Out of all of those, only one passed out, HR 133, passed out off the House floor unanimously and was sent to BESE. The action not considering or implementing any type of relief to address the plight and frustration of current teachers speaks louder than any overused platitude given in place of respect and acknowledgement of them as professionals, as advocates for their children. We would urge you to listen to the conversations that we've had today about the loss of teachers, people not wanting to come into the profession. This is one of the reasons why, because we've asked repeatedly for waivers. Give some relief to what they're facing. Because to use SLPs to judge teachers in a world where you have, or in a classroom where you have kids continually cycling in and out, are they remote? Are they hybrid? Are they in the classroom? Are they quarantined? What are they doing? It's not fair to judge them by that. We're not asking for you not to gather the data, to have tests, but we're asking for you to consider the situation that we as a state find ourselves in due to, situation beyond our control. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bose. Mr. Ford?
Gordon Ford, Executive Director, Lincoln Preparatory School. I do want to come and strenuously oppose the idea of simulated school performance scores for several reasons. School performance scores don't inform instruction. They're simply used to compare schools against each other. And while you can pass a whole harmless policy, it doesn't work against the public. And in this particular case, we keep talking about an apples to oranges type of thing. What we're really talking about is apples to Frankenstein, because there is no relevance to what happened in the past year to what happened in previous years or future years. To give you an example, normally kids go through an entire course of study and take an EOC or Leave 2025 at the end of the year. For most of us, last year, as Ms. Holly, as Dr. Buffy has referenced, when kids did not pass the assessment that was taken this year, and the previous one was waived but not passed, we turned around and tested those kids on a subject that they had not studied in over a year. If a kid failed their English 2, in order to give them an opportunity to pass an English test to graduate, we then turned around and tested them in English 1. That counts as an initial test, even though those kids were not registered in an English 1 class for over a year. We did that in multiple subjects. And so what happened at schools, school performance scores are something that we know what it is, we prepare for it, we have specific strategies for it. This simulated score that we're talking about, nobody knew what that was before we started. Nobody prepared for that. Nobody tested to that. It's something that's suddenly being thrust upon us that we had no opportunity to work toward. And so I think it's unfair to release them. I think it will be prejudicial to schools. I don't care how many whole harmless policies you pass, the news media is going to call me and waste my time asking me about it. And so I strongly urge you not to do it. The information has already been out there. The raw data has been released. I've already answered to the media with regard to the raw data. And so to put this together in a score again, in order to do that, I think it only harms schools. It does nothing to improve education. It does nothing to help children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. There's no further public comment. Members, is there any additional comment from the board? Dr. Brown, I have a few questions just to make sure I understand this correctly. So, first of all, is that we've already shared, I understand that we've already shared with the public that there has been a learning loss, and we've quantified that. So it's very clear with every stakeholder in the game that there has been a learning loss. It's significant. It's a point of concern. And the question is, how do we address it? When we talk about this SPS score, the letter grade score, in my mind, what we're doing here is we're identifying how well the event was managed by different regions of the state. And so this learning loss has already been identified. We're providing more resolution to it. We're saying in this particular area, the score was lower. So this particular area, the event management wasn't handled as well as another area where the SPS was as good or better. My concern is, we live in Louisiana. We're going to have hurricanes. I can't speak to pandemics, but we're going to have hurricanes every year. They're going to be varying degrees. They're going to hit different regions of the state. And at the same time, we are charged with being able to provide our kids, every kid, with a quality education. And whether or not there's a hurricane or the sun shining or whatever. My concern is being able to recognize and support areas that did have a lower SPS because they didn't have the resources they needed, or whatever, to manage the event better than other areas did. So my concern is use of the word judgment. I heard somebody use that word. Personally, I don't like the use of that word in this conversation. I don't think this is about judgment. I think this is about event management, It's about providing appropriate resources where they're needed for that management and having a plan in place so that we can proactively address those needs. So I just want to go on record that I oppose the use of the word judgment. If this CSPS does get passed, it's clearly not the intent. The intent, as I understand it, is really to identify where help is needed and be able to provide that help in a timely manner appropriately. Thank you, Ms. Boucher.
We have something in state law that says now, if we have a hurricane, if the school's not set for 18 consecutive school days, they do not get an SPS for the year. So in terms of, I guess, a catastrophic event or a severe hurricane like we just experienced in some of our areas, that is going to be suspended now. In our next committee meeting, we better get through it, the one on the chair. There is an allocation that this board is going to be asked to consider, the department is bringing forward, because they've already identified what schools have been the most impacted school-wise. Schools that have the greatest drop in percentage of mastery kids or the greatest increase in the percentage of unsatisfactory kids. So we have data that tells us where the greatest impacts occur, for whatever reasons they are. We can maybe say what those reasons are for those particular schools. But we have mechanisms to do that. The data is there. I guess we're all just kind of repeating what we've said over and over. The data is there. The data has been released. The educators in every school throughout our state has looked at that data, has already developed plans for the individual students. If they had significant drops that scored below their individual academic plans already in place for the year. So we've used that data for what its purpose was intended, to inform instruction for our students. When we give and develop an assessment index, which we all have done for our schools, which I'm sure the department has done for the schools, but we'll do it shortly, and the growth index and all these different things, we already have, or will have that data. So I guess I still do not see the benefit to students, to schools, to educators, or to the community to simulate a score that we're going to put a little asterisk or a C on to say, can't compare it with what it was before. Just to do it. I don't see a purpose, not even to the community, to simulate that particular score. I certainly know there is no benefit in my mind to any of our students or our scores or our educational process or our instructional issue. And I guess that's all I can say.
Thank you, Ms. Wiltshire. Other members? Dr. Conley, I have one more question. With regard to the carryover letter grades, so my understanding is that the concern there is that we wouldn't be able to calculate the growth component because there was no test taken that year. So you're looping over that and carrying over. So that's the middle year or the 2-year calculation. What happens next year when that becomes the first year in the calculation? And the data is not there.
Yeah, Mr. Lambert, will add some clarity to that. Essentially, the progress index is a 2-year rolling measure, right, as you just mentioned. We would continue to utilize that as a component in there, but we would have more time to study it and confirm that it is indeed valid. Second, by that point, we may have new ideas around the methodology for BAM and the progress index generally. So we have some time to figure that out.
So bottom line is we don't have the answer to that question right now.
That's correct.
Okay, so this year we don't have an SPS. We're proposing a C SPS. What are we looking at next year?
I think that we have a working group that's been expanded to study accountability going forward, and we put that on the list, and we're happy to engage on that and work on that together.
So bottom line is we don't know what the answer is for 2 years for sure right now. So the question at hand is not just for this year, but folks need to be aware that the same situation is going to exist the same situation is going to exist next year, or the same question will come before this board next year as we stand right now.
I don't know that this exact question will come before the board a year from now. I think it's unlikely that it'll be the exact same question. I think that we've got a lot of opportunity over the next year to look at this and study it and make sure that it's exactly the methodology that we want to use and really dig in and understand the validity of it.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Brumley, so given that clarification, my question is, going back to my original point, is that we live in Louisiana, there's going to be hurricanes every year. It's just a matter of where it gets hit and what the strength of the hurricane is and the impact on the school system. So, so we could potentially, right now, it looks like for one event, it impacts the SBS for 2 years. And then next year we could have, you know, the same issue again. And so we're sort of kicking the can down the road if we don't have something in place that addresses event management in our state on an ongoing basis. So that's my concern. If there is no CSPS or whatever you want to call it, then we have no indication, or at least the public has no indication of how well these events are being managed in the public education system.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Mr. Morris, we've been managing events since the beginning of the pandemic in whatever ways that we felt like we had to manage them as a board, as an agency, as school systems, to try and work our way through this. There has not been a playbook that was previously written, and I feel like this board and our agency and systems have done a really fine job of response. This is just another example of we're in a situation we've never been. We're having to solve how do we handle this particular issue, and we're trying to find a place that we felt like made sense, both in terms of all sides of the argument.
Is there any additional, Dr. Davis?
I guess, Mr. Morris, your use of the phrase event management and thinking about things in those terms makes me reluctant to think about SPS and issuing those scores in light of that terminology, in part, right, because a lot of event management by districts is completely outside of their control. If you're living in a rural area of Louisiana without access to broadband or reliable internet access, even if you manage that event as well as you could, and you brought in devices that you put on school buses, that you parked in restaurants, and you did everything that you could, right, rolling out all of those things that help you manage that event, right, even if you did as you were a superstar in terms of the limited resources and the access that you had to, you know, resources and materials, your SPS score is going to be negatively affected by that. And so when we think about them in terms of event management, like even then, it's not capturing the kind of information that you're wanting it to capture. And I'm not sure that SPSS right, was ever designed to be thought about in terms of event management. And I think that probably for me, at the end of the day, when I'm thinking about this, when we were pressing LEAP, right, and making sure that we were doing LEAP, even to the extent to which I think we pressured to the adversity of some parents to get their kids in school over their health objections to take the LEAP. We did that under the auspices of, we wanted to know how kids were doing so that our teachers and our principals and our superintendents could have the information that they needed to move those kids forward. And so I guess that my question is, from an educational perspective, do districts now, and do schools now, and do teachers now have the information that they need already, absent these simulated SPSS scores, to move children forward? I mean, I think that at the end of the day, that's the question that should be before this board.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Other comments? Okay, moving forward, if Dr. Bovee put a substitute motion on the board. Dr. Bovee, help me out here. My understanding is that you wanted to approve recommendation number 1. For recommendation number 2, you wanted to change the date to as soon as possible, and you can make it contingent on waiver approval. Is that correct?
Fantastic job there, Chair.
Doing the best I can in your footsteps. So we got a substitute motion on the floor. Is there any opposition to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
That concludes your agenda.